Mary, what was the backdrop you had on there?
That was Manchester, but
Okay.
it
looked
it's
great.
hard to see when that one's on. Depends on the light of the day.
No, I mean, I was so many people use Boston as the backdrop.
No, Manchester.
But it's not Boston, but it's got the river and
My old hometown.
yeah. Actually, the garden was the best.
Oh, yeah, it doesn't look too good right now. But I'm still picking spinach and arugula and peppers and celery. There's still a lot of stuff growing, amazingly.
Yeah, it's been a long season.
Yeah. And then what the deers don't get, the turkeys will.
So I think Jay said he might be a few minutes late. We're missing Mel. John Morgan. Bill. So we'll wait a couple more minutes for people to join in.
You know, I saw on the public comment, there was a comment about wanting to release SPEDIS numbers or the, I'm assuming they're meaning the numbers that go along with catastrophic aid. I was wondering if anybody knows what that was really about.
I wondered the same thing. I mean, and we don't even call them SPEDIS numbers anymore. It's now necessary.
Well, you know, it's really, in a lot of communities, they sometimes are awful to the people who they know are causing those funds. So that's something that we really have to be careful about. I've seen a lot of ugly things.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Mary. I actually haven't seen the I don't know if this was in the email that just came over this afternoon or late this morning. I haven't looked at it yet, but none of the commission's work was based on anything that isn't publicly available from the Department of Ed. So early on, I think we had actually looked at getting more of a drill down onto the numbers that break out the different levels of complexity and cost, and it was really clear that the department made it very clear that they were concerned about releasing that information for, I think, the reasons you laid out. So I'm actually very glad that hey, anybody can look at all the information that was used for the AIR findings because it's all publicly available.
It is actually listed by community on the department website, but you have to dig pretty deep.
Yeah, I didn't really see the relevance to our mission. It seemed like a general complaint about things that not really related specifically to school funding.
Mm-hmm.
It's an issue that taxpayers often have.
Well, maybe that's something like I said, I haven't taken a look at it yet. So, but maybe it's something that we refer over to the department. All right. So Mel's on board. Who are we still waiting for? Maybe John Beardmore. John Morgan's here. I know Jay's going to be a few minutes late. And it's great to see Superintendent Ryan with us. Great to see you, Dave.
Thanks, Dave. Good to see you guys. Just trying to get some lunch in while we're on.
Oh, please do. So
I do have to jump off at 3, and I apologize for that. I have a impromptu board meeting.
Yep. All right, great. So why don't we, Bruce, what do you think? We can get this thing
yeah, let's go and start.
order, get this thing going. So So terrific. Then I'll call to order this meeting of the Commission to Study School Funding. Today is October 19th, 2020, just a little bit after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And so we're actually, today's meeting is an extended meeting. Normally we meet 2 to 4. And this one we're looking at 1 to 4:30. So there's a lot on the docket today. And I think, and again, I should really look at the calendar before this, but I think sort of for everybody's general information, as we're getting into to crunch time and report writing and documenting our findings and stuff like that, that commission meetings are generally going to be happening weekly on Mondays. Is that right, Bruce, or is it this Monday and next Monday?
This Monday and next Monday, and I don't have it in front of me. Jordan might actually. I think that's all we've accelerated, but still a possibility that we'll add more Monday commission meetings.
Right. And so work groups are really sort of finishing up their data fact finding and data gathering and pulling together some final things. And I think we're sort of looking at Thursdays as needed for work group meetings. I think we've got them all plugged in for this week, but work groups can decide and call an audible as to whether or not they need those meetings, and we'll make those adjustments accordingly. So let's see. So we're going to get started with a roll call, and so per the governor's emergency order, remote meetings can be held, but we'll begin with a roll call of the members, see who's here. So I'll start it out. Dave Luno here in Hopkinton with Ozzy the long-haired dachshund in the house. And next up, Mel Myler.
Mel Myler calling in from Port Clyde, Maine. My wife is in the house.
Great. And Dick Ames.
Yeah, Dick Ames here in Jaffrey in my home office alone.
Great. And Rick Ladd.
Rick Ladd's here in Haverhill, New Hampshire, in the living room alone.
How much snow this morning?
None, but the other day I showed you I sent you a picture and we were covered with a good 1.5 to 2 inches.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's great. I think it's great.
We call that up in Alaska termination dust. You know, as it comes lower in the mountain, it means it's going to get you.
Yeah.
Coming down the side of Mount Mooselock.
Yep. Let's see. Jay Kahn. Jay on yet? Maybe not, but John Morgan I saw. Oh, Jay is here. Yeah.
President Keene, on my own currently. Expect someone to be in the house later. Yep.
Terrific.
And John Morgan?
I'm here in Exeter. I have a staff member and my kids on virtual school in SAU 16.
Great. And Bill Ardinger?
Yes, I'm here in Concord at my law office by myself.
All right, thanks, Bill. And Jane Bergeron?
Afternoon, Jane Bergeron. I'm home alone in Litchfield with my Black Labrador Otis.
All right. You and Otis today. So great. Thank you, Jane. And Corinne Cascadden?
Hi, Corinne Cascadden in my home office in Berlin, New Hampshire.
And Dave Ryan?
Hi, everyone. I'm Dave Ryan, Superintendent, SAU 16, in the office, 30 Linden Street. Just me and the street sweeper that went by, so I apologize for that noise.
Great. Thanks, David. And let's see, I don't know if John Beardmore is with us today. I don't see him, but Iris Estabrook?
Hi, Iris Estabrook, home in Barrington. No one's around.
Thanks, Iris. And Barbara Tremblay?
Hello all, Barbara Tremblay and Keene. Husband is in the other room. Good to see you all.
Great to see you, Barbara. Thank you. And Chris Dwyer?
Hi, I'm in my Portsmouth office and I'm alone today.
Thanks, Chris. And Susan Heward?
Hello, I'm in Hooksett with a husband downstairs.
Okay, and Val Zanchuk.
Good afternoon, alone in my office in Jaffrey.
Thanks, Val. And Mary Heath.
Mary Heath here in Manchester, and my husband's downstairs having PT.
Okay, and we've got our team from the Carsey School, starting with Jordan Hensley.
Jordan Hensley here in Dover. My fiance is also around.
Great, thanks, Jordan. We've got Bruce Mallory.
Yeah, I'm here in Kittery Point, Maine at my house with family also in the house. And John Beardmore indicated he'd be about an hour late joining today's meeting.
Okay, great, thanks. And is Kerry, I don't see Kerry with us yet.
He's working on some engagement tasks.
Okay, great. So, Jordan, how are we looking as far as public access?
I think we're good. Have not got any comments about any issues, and we've got 14 other folks on the line with us today.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I know we got a lot on the docket today, but before we get things going, we'll just sort of a quick review on what one of the things that sort of binds these meetings together, which is our group agreements, so that we can hear everybody out and work on these things. So quick review on those, Bruce. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thanks. I try to mute myself and then I forget, of course. The first group agreement, especially important as we move into our substantive deliberations, is be open-minded. Second, listen first. It's okay to disagree, but don't personalize it. Focus on the idea, not the person. If you can disagree, consider asking a question rather than arguing to prove your point. Accept working through conflict as a catalyst for learning. It's okay to push issues like race and class on the table. Be purposeful and to the point. Notice if what you're conveying is or is not pertinent to the topic at hand. Take risks, make some mistakes, then let go. And we all share responsibility for making this a productive conversation.
Great. Thanks, Bruce. And before we dig into things, we've got there were minutes from our meeting on October 5th that I think I know they were sent out, and they're also posted on the website. So if everybody's had a chance to give them a quick look-see, I would take a motion to approve the minutes of the commission meeting from October 5th.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Myler and seconded by Tremblay. So are there further discussion, comments, feedback, amplification, deletion that anybody wants to make on these minutes? Seeing none, we'll do a quick, quick roll call to get through them. Luno, yes. Myler?
Yes.
Ames?
Yes.
Ladd?
Yes.
Khan?
You want me to vote for Jay?
Sure.
Jay's.
Yeah,
Yes.
He's there. Yes. Yeah, Morgan?
Yes.
Ardinger?
Yes.
Bergeron?
Yes.
Cascadden?
Yes.
Ryan?
Abstain.
Beardmore? Oh, Beardmore. Estabrook?
Yes.
Tremblay?
Yes.
Dwyer?
Yes.
Stewart?
Yes.
Zanchuk?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, the motion carries. Minutes are approved. Get back to the agenda. And so this, I think, takes us next into a really discussion of the estimated cost model that AIR has assembled for us based on their research on this. And I think there's a number of outstanding questions. And Bruce, I'm just going to hand it over to you to sort of lead us into what some of those questions are. And then I see Drew's with us. So Drew, welcome. And Bruce, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. We've asked Drew to walk us through what it means to apply a regression methodology to the variables that go into costing adequacy. Do use that language. It seems that maybe there are sort of three sets of folks within the commission, including your humble staff. Those of us that took statistics in graduate school and totally get everything that Drew has talked about in terms of regression and could have written the formula ourselves. That's probably a fairly small subset. Those of us that get the general idea and concept and are willing to accept sort of at face value the analysis and the methodology that's been done. And then those of us that are really still kind of uncomfortable with accepting the findings of the regression analysis because they're so foundational to setting other decisions and funding levels, frankly, and approaches to funding, and would like to be sure that they are confident that this is an appropriate methodology for arriving at, as we call it, an estimated cost model. And so Drew has prepared, a written memorandum, which I think, is one resource for us. And he's also going to kind of talk us through that here. There'll be some additional questions I'm sure you'll have for Drew, perhaps related to the regression model, but also other questions you might have about variables. For example, we know that the question about how middle school grades were treated, have been treated in the model continues to come up, and others that you might have as well. So with that, then I'll ask Drew to talk us through this. And we have about a half an hour because of our extended time today to be sure that everybody is comfortable with an understanding of the methodology. The last thing I'll say is, if you remember back to long ago when we first began to organize ourselves in January and February, one of the key questions that we had was, what is the appropriate methodology to bring to bear on understanding the way that we fund schools and the costs that go into funding schools, and what are the alternatives? And we had presentations from the Education Commission of the States, the National Council of State Legislatures, and then we put out to bid our needs relative to the kind of analysis that the commission needed in order to make its policy decisions. And when we did that, we thought, what's the best approach to a methodology for analyzing these data? And the bids that came back gave us a couple of options. As a commission as a whole, we felt that the outcome-based approach using an empirical statistical framework that accounted for costs would be most useful for us. And that's why we're here today in October with that, having made that decision back in June, I guess, or May or June, when we chose our outside consultant. So here we are, and again, it's important that we all feel confident enough in the way that we've arrived at our current points of decision so that we can continue to move towards more specific decisions and policy recommendations in the next month. So that sets it up for Drew.
All right. Well, I'm glad to be back with you all and talk through this. And I know this kind of, I think, as Bruce was mentioning, there's, I think the presentation here is split up into two pieces. The first is kind of a general, kind of a 101 lesson on regression to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of understanding what regression does. And then the second walks through some examples of applying our results to some specific districts. And what I provided to the commission is this PowerPoint. I know in some previous cases I have provided a written memo, but I have not provided a written memo on this because we thought it might be best to just go through this PowerPoint. But after we go through the PowerPoint, if the commission and the commission leadership think a memo would be helpful as well, then we'd be happy to discuss that as well. But let's get into this because I know we only have 30 minutes and there's a few slides that I have to get through. So, but at any point, feel free to stop me and ask questions, or I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions at the end as well. But we start off with just example of simple regression. So this is a scatter plot showing the relationship between student outcomes and free and reduced price lunch. And this is the same scatter plot that's in the brief, although in the brief, or in the report that we provided, although in the report, the scatter plot is weighted by district enrollment, so that the dots are of different size. But for the simplicity here, this is not weighted by enrollment and all the dots are the same size, but this is the same, all the dots are in the same places as in the report. So regression is just a method that can be used to describe the statistical relationship between an outcome variable and some sort of input or predictor variable. And here, this scatter plot shows our outcome factor score that we developed for each school district and free and reduced price lunch, so we can describe how free and reduced price lunch is related to the outcome factor score. And we do this by fitting a line that best describes the data. And in algebra, a line was given a formula, y equals mx plus b. In regression lingo, it's the same thing, but the terms are in slightly different places. So we have an outcome, that's our y variable. The beta 0 is the constant, which is the same as the b in the y equals mx plus b, that's your intercept term. Then there's a slope coefficient, which is beta 1 in this case, and your x value, which is free and reduced price lunch. And then there's error, which I'll talk about in a second. But all we're doing is fitting a line that best describes the data, and we have a slope and we have an intercept. So in this case, the slope is negative 4.34. So because free and reduced price lunch was entered as a proportion rather than a percentage, this means that a 1 unit increase or a increase from 0 to 100% free and reduced price lunch results in a lower outcome by 4.34. And in this case, the outcome is in standard deviation. So that's our slope term. And then we have a y-intercept term, which is where the line intercepts the y-axis when free and reduced price lunch is 0. So at a free and reduced price lunch rate of 0, our expected outcome is 1.46 standard deviation. So we can use these two terms along with the free and reduced price lunch percentage to draw this line here. And that's all that regression does. It picks a line that best fits the data that we have. So the formula can be used to generate predictions for each observation. In this example, the orange dot is the prediction, and all predictions fall along that line, the best fit line. And this particular prediction is for the district that's marked as the green dot here. So our prediction here says that a district with 39% free and reduced price lunch is expected to have an outcome of -0.24. So that's our prediction. And then for each unit, for each observation, there's an error term. And this is the green line shown is the error term for this prediction. So that's the difference between the actual value and the predicted value. And regression works by minimizing the error terms across all observations in the data. So if you added up all of the green lines on this figure, that orange line results in the smallest total length of those green lines that's possible. If you move the orange line up or down, if you change the slope slightly, the total length of those green segments is going to increase. So regression works to minimize the amount of error across all observations. And another property of linear regression is that it also has a 0 average error. So if you add up the errors above the orange line, they'll be exactly the same as the total amount of error, the green lines below the orange line. So that's just some simple properties of linear regression. And we're doing this with one outcome variable, one predictor variable, because it's very easy to show this graphically, but the same principles apply for multivariate regression, where you have a whole bunch of predictor variables and the model is simply estimating a set of relationships that generate the best predictions possible, which have the lowest amount of error possible. So that's just regression in a nutshell. So I'll stop there briefly to see if there's any questions about this before moving on to how we applied the regression in our cost model for this particular study.
So thanks, Drew. Anybody with questions for Drew on this sort of regression briefer, or anything that needs a little bit more clarification? If so, please jump in.
David, I might ask that when you add several variables that are independent or to the outcome variable, how do they fit together? What is it? How does it change the outcome of a single variable?
I mean, it's still working in combination to minimize the amount of error. And so if you have two related variables, then one of the variables might kind of be stronger in relation to the outcome than another variable. So you might find a stronger relationship for one of those two variables compared to another. For example, if we had free and reduced price lunch and average income in the same model here, one of those variables would probably be a stronger predictor than the other variable, and that would kind of overpower the other variable. So you might find a relationship for free and reduced price lunch, and you might not find a relationship for income, or it might just be that they kind of split the variation in two, and you might find just weaker relationships across both of them, but they end up adding up to the same thing. So when you have variables that are related, the amount of variation that those variables can explain doesn't change, but they kind of have to split up the explanatory power. So, so I guess that's kind of how it works. But if you dropped one of those variables out of the regression, then then the other variable would kind of suck up the power from the other variable, and it would change the slope term for the remaining variable, right? So, but when you have them all in there at the same time, they're all working together to try to generate the best prediction possible.
And so when we add special education or English language learners into the model, it might compensate a little bit for free and reduced lunch, but by and large, there's not as much overlap as in the example you just used.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And we did do a multivariate regression, just looking at the relationship between outcomes and those factors. And when we included all of those factors in the same model, free and reduced price lunch, English learners, and special education all had independent relationships with outcomes. So I guess that's the other way of thinking about it, is that when you're including only one of these variables at a time, that variable can be confounded with the other variables that are left out. So free and reduced price lunch, it is their high special ed districts are likely to have more free and reduced price lunch. High English learner districts are likely to have more free and reduced price lunch. So when you include these variables one at a time, it's not only explaining what the relationship is between free and reduced price lunch, but it's also trying to explain the relationship between these other variables that are left out of the model, but are also related to free and reduced price lunch. So by including the different variables in the model, it's you're identifying independent relationships between the variables, but when you add them all up, they still generate the best predictions possible. All right, I'll keep moving, and I'm sure there'll be more questions when we get into the application in our specific example here.
Great.
Yeah, I just had one question for Drew on the regression analysis here. Is there any kind of relationship with, Jay asked the question, he brought in income, poverty levels. Is there a relationship between age of schoolhouses and this regression formula?
I'm not sure, because we didn't have any data on the age of schoolhouses. And I'm not, I mean, that's just a complicated, complicated variable to define when you're talking about age of schoolhouses. Also, you have to consider renovations. I mean, you might find that in kind of the more populated areas, the school buildings are going to be older because they were populated first, and so the buildings that are there might be just older because that's where the population first started, and that's where they first built the school buildings. And then when you get to the suburbs, they're going to be newer. So I think there's all sorts of reasons why buildings would differ in age, and then how do you factor in renovations into the calculation of the age of school buildings. So I don't know what the relationship between poverty or free and reduced price lunch is in school buildings. If we had that data, we could certainly test it, but I'm not sure I have any hypotheses as to what the relationship might be.
Well, I asked that question because there has been certain data and research on this topic, and there apparently is a relationship between the various conditions and elements within a schoolhouse and achievement.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. So here we're getting into the application of regression to generate the cost model results. So in our report, we describe the cost model in this kind of conceptual model where we have spending per pupil as the left-hand variable as a function of student outcomes, student needs, enrollment size, grade shares, the price of staffing, efficiency of spending, and year, because we have a panel of, I think, 11 years worth of data that we use in this model. So that's kind of the general description of the cost model. If we apply a mathematical model using the coefficients and constant terms, it looks like what's in the lower part of the slide here. And we didn't present it this way in the report because it's a little more technical, but just to explain how regression works, you can see there's beta 0, a constant term, and then for each variable included in the model, there's a different slope coefficient. So here, there's 15 different slope coefficients, and when we apply the constant term and all of the different slope coefficients, we can generate a prediction that is the predicted cost of education. And when we applied the cost model, we came up with these different parameters. And so this is just the table that's in the appendix of the report. And each variable is associated with a different coefficient, and these coefficients become the slope terms in the model. And the constant term is at the bottom, 9.14. So that's the log of spending if all of these other variables were set to 0. And I'll explain how these can all be used in a calculation to come up with a predicted cost. So again, here's the mathematical model with all of the beta terms in there. You can pull out the beta terms and substitute in the actual parameters that are estimated by the model to come up with a formula that can be used to predict the cost of education. So the bottom half is just pulling out the betas and plugging in the values that were in the table on the previous slide. So here is an example for Manchester. I know, I think Bill challenged us to come up with examples comparing Manchester and Bedford. So on these slides, we're looking at the predicted costs in Manchester. So we apply the coefficients from the cost model to the values that are used in predicting the cost for Manchester. And in our cost model, we have efficiency controls and we have the outcome. And our task is to project the cost, assuming that allowing all districts to achieve a common set of outcomes. And so the way that we do this is we set the outcome variable to the state average, and we set the efficiency variables to the state average, and allow all the other variables to vary across districts according to their observed values. So for Manchester and all other districts, we set the outcome to 0, which is the state average, and that shouldn't have a percent there. It should just be as standard deviations, but that's okay. And then we have the share of population, that's 5 to 17, the federal revenue share, and the Herfindahl index. And those are 3 variables that we selected to represent efficiency. So you might think that having more of your population that's of a schooling age might affect how much you decide to spend in your district. Having more dollars from the federal government with certain strings attached to how you use those dollars might affect both how much you spend overall and how you use those dollars to contribute to outcomes. And the Herfindahl index is a measure of competition. If you live in a more competitive area with more, with your students spread across more school districts, you might expect different levels of efficiency compared to if you live in a more isolated area where all the students kind of have to go to one school district. So it's kind of a measure of district competition. And then all the rest of the variables vary according to the observed values for Manchester. Manchester has a free and reduced price lunch percentage of 58%, a special education percentage of 19%, an EL percentage of 15%. Because Manchester has more than 2,000 students, we do not apply any of the enrollment categorical variables to Manchester, so we set all of those to 0. The 22% of Manchester students are in middle school grades and 29% are in high school grades. The staff price variable that we use is called a competitive wage variable. So it basically says how much you have to pay individuals who have a master's degree or a comparable qualifications to a teacher in a given area. So compared to the national average, you have to pay Manchester and people in Manchester about the national average who have the same qualifications as teachers. And then the year variable is set to 0, which we centered the year on 2018-19. So 0 represents 2018-19 in this case. So when you plug all those numbers into the formula for Manchester, you end up with a prediction of $22,695. So we did the same for all districts. This is a case for Bedford, but you can see that Bedford has a far lower free and reduced price lunch percentage, lower special education, lower English learners, slightly higher middle school and high school enrollment, but everything else is the same. And when you plug those values through the formula for Bedford, you get a prediction of $12,918.
And so Drew, if I could interject, so both of those dollar amounts are the predicted dollar amounts necessary per pupil to achieve the state average outcome scores or performance scores. Is that, that correctly? Correct. And then a quick question on population share. Is that 14% in Bedford? Is that 14% of the Bedford population is school-age children, 5 to 17?
That's one of the variables that we set to the state average. So because we wanted to make predictions as if all districts were operating at the same level of efficiency, we set that variable along with the federal revenue share and the Herfindahl index to the state average. So 14% of the total population in the state is ages 5 to 17.
Okay, thanks. See, Iris has her hand up. Unmute there, Iris.
Building Bruce's explanation that what we're talking about are the dollars needed to have the opportunity to reach the average outcome, right? So as you provide that funding over time, the districts will either improve in terms of getting closer to that average outcome, or they won't. What I'd like to know is what happens to this model over time as the amounts that are provided begin to affect outcomes.
I mean, I think that's a hard question to anticipate, but if all districts ended up actually achieving the average outcome and all districts spent the levels of dollars that we're predicting, then the model wouldn't change at all, because spending would go up for the high need districts, spending would go down for the lower need districts, and they would all end up achieving the state average outcome. So the model would essentially remain the same. If spending went up in the high need districts and outcomes didn't go up as much as we expect, then if we re-estimated the model, then it might say that the high need districts, we were underestimating the cost of education for those high need districts, and maybe they actually need a little bit more. So if we re-estimated it in 5 years and spending in Manchester went up substantially and outcomes didn't go up to the state average, then the re-estimated cost model might say that Manchester still needs a little bit more than what we originally predicted.
So Drew, if you could stay on that point for a little bit, and how did so that's really sort of a step one question, right? Or step one in the process?
So if you're talking about kind of our 3-step approach, so this is, we're still on step 1, which is just estimating the cost model here. So then step 2 is estimating the weights, which we'll get to in a second. And then step 3 is the simulation portion. So we're still on step 1 of our 3-step process for calculating the cost here.
Right. So going back to what you just said then, basically the estimated cost model in step 1 based on current spending, FY19 spending and FY19 outcomes.
Yep.
Get you to this. And let's say 5 years or 7 years hence, we want to do what Iris just looked at. Let's just say Manchester's spending did go up significantly from what it, or what they're doing now, and their outcomes didn't change. Then you would have sort of, I mean, let's just pick the date, and FY 29 numbers to work from in terms of dollars spent on education and the outcomes, and it would be different data than you've got right now.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So we would use updated data to re-estimate the cost model and see how those relationships might have changed in the intervening time period. But I mean, I would think that the likely scenarios would be that maybe the lower need districts or the high need districts that got more money, maybe they did really substantially increase their funding and or increase their outcomes. And if they did increase their outcomes, then maybe our cost model was right on target, and they increased their outcomes to as much as we had expected them to, and the spending increased the same amount as we expected. And so in that case, then our cost model wouldn't change much after re-estimating. If the spending went up a lot and the outcomes didn't change very much, then that would be a situation where maybe our originally estimated cost model wasn't strong enough, or didn't identify the right set of student needs or something like that. And so in that case, if spending goes up and outcomes don't increase in line, then the new cost model would probably adjust and say that these districts need a little bit more still.
And I think that, and I know we've got Dick and Rick with questions, but what you just said there is also a good, supports what we've been talking about in terms of identifying what data should be collected for when the next round of this happens.
Yeah. I mean, and right. I mean, the more detailed student needs variables you have, the more detailed outcome variables you have, the more precise our cost model can be. So we're working with what are fairly kind of rudimentary levels of or types of student outcome data and kind of the typical student needs variables. So if we had more precise data, we might expect, I mean, the cost model might have predicted something slightly different, but we don't, I mean, at this point, we don't know.
So, great, thanks, Drew. Dick Ames, then Rick Ladd.
Thank you. So I'm trying to get my head around this thing. The way I understand it is that your starting point is the average outcome in the state, which is pretty good relative to all other states around. And so that is our target that you work off of. And then there's an assumption, I think, that our current spending level on average is what enables that outcome. So that current spending level in effect gets keyed into this formula. And that then leads with all the other numbers that you've developed through your analysis to 12,918 for Bedford and 22,000 something per pupil for Manchester. And I guess I'm wondering why you would pick the average current spending of New Hampshire as the current spending levels in New Hampshire as sort of the dollar input that you put into this formula, which leads inevitably, unsurprisingly, I think is your word in your report, to a total spend that is approximately equal to our current total spend. Could you have chosen, say, 10% less than the statewide average spending level, on the theory that part of this success in New Hampshire on an outcome basis relates to sort of engagement at the local level in the educational process that has a different quality than dollars? Could you have chosen to put into this formula either a lower number or a range across a low and a high, instead of what you, I believe, have done directly or indirectly that leads you to a total spend that's approximately equal to the current spend?
Yeah, I mean, so in this case, the outcome is really what's affecting the overall level of spending. So if we set the outcome to a higher value, the overall level of spending goes up. If we set the outcome to a lower value, the overall level of spending goes down. But in your example, your example is that there's some kind of local factor that might be also affecting outcomes. But the state's overall level of outcomes is what it is. So your assumption would also be that whatever that local engagement variable is, that would be at its existing level as well, right? So local engagement would also be set to the state average. So we would assume some sort of average level of local engagement across all school districts, and you would still end up with the same amount of overall spending that's required to achieve a given level of outcome, unless you made a different assumption about engagement. If you said engagement is going to increase by 15% in the state in the next 5 years, and we're going to depend on that to increase outcomes rather than increasing spending, then you could make a different assumption about what's required to achieve a given set of outcomes. But I think that would be an untested assumption, and I'm not sure what that assumption would be based on. But if you start with the premise that the state overall is achieving a given set of outcomes, and the inputs for those outcomes are the overall amount of spending that the state is spending, and whatever other underlying engagement variables there might be, or attributes of the state that are contributing to those outcomes, those engagements and other attributes aren't going to be changing either. So I think you would still require the total spending we're using here to achieve a given set of outcomes.
Does that help, Dick?
Yeah, I'm still puzzling over it, to be honest. So in the spending, we have the spending of some very high spending districts. We're putting those dollars into this pot indirectly. And those districts may or may not be at outcome levels that are higher. But it's those extra dollars that are in the pot. We seem to have locked ourselves into a process that leads us inevitably to a per student figure, that spending figure that is going to be $16,000 or $17,000, since we're going to take off the federal spending and a couple of other things, and that's going to be the per pupil spending, and then it's going to be very different from current spending levels at the local district level because of all the factors that are going into the analysis, but the total cost is going to be where it is now. And that total cost where it is now includes a lot of spending that is well above the norm. And I'm trying to get my head around why that spend level is what we should be pushing for.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, if that level of spending is contributing to the higher outcomes in those districts, then then our model would be picking that up. If it's not, then I think that would be an example of inefficiency, and our efficiency variables should be accounting for that as well. So I mean, yeah.
So Dick, is what you're talking about, I mean, there's certainly a strong correlation between spending and outcomes. That was documented in the AIR report very early on. But it sounds like you're also suggesting that while that correlation exists, there could be other contributing factors that lead to those outcomes, not directly the spending, but let's say everybody in let's say everybody in Hanover sends their kids to summer camp and they get piano lessons and sailing lessons and everything else. That would also be a contributing factor to outcomes, probably, or could be, that don't get that in this model are being attributed to how much, and again, I'm just using Hanover as an example, to how much Hanover is spending. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
That's part of it. Just trying to understand how we get to this point. And let me throw in another analogy. In Massachusetts,
this is gonna take a while on this segment. I know we've already blown through and I'm not getting on anybody here, but I want to make sure that we've got ample time to go through Drew's.
So Massachusetts approaches this whole challenge differently and has done so for 20 odd years. And they've got a foundation budget concept that is sort of equivalent to our adequacy concept. And they've got success in terms of performance outcomes that's approximately equivalent to New Hampshire's. And they have developed their foundation budget through an input process, costing out a whole slew of inputs and developing weights. And through that process, they've developed a foundation budget that's about 25%, 26%, according to what I saw the other day, less than the total spending of the school districts. And they're doing pretty well. So through this outcome analysis, we're getting sort of inevitably, by the way in which it's constructed, to a point where we're going to, we've developed a district by district formula spend level that adds up to a total spend that's equal to our current spend. And if you did that in Massachusetts, I guess you'd say that the foundation budget should be at 25% higher, or whatever it is, 125% above where it is now. And so I'm trying to understand why we need to go to where we're going with this formula as opposed to a lower level would still be a very robust level.
So Dick, let me just jump in there for a second, because I think Drew's been pretty clear on this, that this is an estimated cost model. This isn't a statement on adequacy or the cost of inadequate education. It's what it would cost. It's the estimate of spending per district in order for the average outcomes in each district to essentially be what's currently state average.
Okay. Well, that's fine. If we can, I'm comfortable with that as long as that's very clear.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing to know too for this commission, because as we look to improve student equity and taxpayer equity, that the student equity part of it is really important, and it's important that it doesn't matter what your zip code is, that you've got the same opportunity in town A or in city A as town B for equitable outcomes, and I think that's what AIR's analysis has showed us.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think if you did take an approach where you said let's set the foundation level at 75% of our predicted costs here, I think you would want to be realistic about what that would mean for student equity. What's going to happen to that remaining 25% of dollars that we're not accounting for in this formula? Who's going to get that 25% of the dollars? How is that going to be spread across districts realistically? And I would think it would contribute to inequity. Anytime you don't account for dollars, then the dollars you're not accounting for are going to end up in the districts that have the most. So I would just be realistic about that concern.
Great, thanks, Drew. And we are actually going to be talking a little bit more about the Massachusetts Chapter 7, the new Chapter 70 model, which I think is just rolling out in the first year in FY21. So we'll be talking about that, I think, a little bit later. So Rick, I know you've been very patient. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dave and Drew. I'm trying to do the same as Dick right now, trying to wrap my mind around this average outcome designed around current spending in our cost model here. And looking at the cost model, I'm looking at one of the variables, the one that Drew spoke of, which was a comparative wage variable. And I'm looking at a city like a Manchester, which has a superintendent, deputy superintendents and deputy superintendents and curriculum directors and curriculum this and that. And then I look at a little town like Colebrook, which is lucky to have a superintendent. I'm looking at our initial model, which we had, which was input-based for adequacy. And it appears to me that there we used a bachelor's plus X number of years, and that was an average amount which we built into adequacy for everybody. There was no administrative costs built in. There were no nursing costs built in. There are a lot of contracted service costs which weren't built in. Apparently, Drew, is this correct that you're building in every cost, regardless whether certified, non-certified, contracted service, administration of some kind? Help me out a little bit with how this wage variable was designed.
Yeah, so what it does is it estimates the price level of individuals who are actually not in the education space, who have similar credentials as individuals who would be employed as teachers. So what you don't want to do is use actual teacher salaries or average teacher salaries, because that's going to be very highly correlated to district actual spending. if you include those in there, then you're going to end up rewarding high spending districts who also pay their teachers well, and penalizing low spending districts who don't pay their teachers well. So we don't want to include a variable that is the actual staff spending. So what this does is it estimates the cost of other professionals in a given area. So for example, nurses or police officers who would have similar credentials as teachers but are employed in a different profession. So in Manchester, the price of staff is 0.99, which means it's about on par with the national average. So teachers, or I guess not individuals who are not teachers but have the same level of credentials as teachers, nurses, police officers, etc., are paid similarly in Manchester as the national average of those types of staff. If you go to a different community that has lower costs or higher amenities, you might not have to pay those types of staff the same level. So it's using the price of other staff who are not in education to estimate what the cost should be to require to hire and retain individuals who are teachers. So that's what that price level does. It's basically like a geographic difference estimator. So it's using a cost of living adjustment. It costs more in New York City to live than it does in Albany. So you might want to compensate districts that have to pay their staff to teach in New York City because it costs so much to live there. It's a similar idea that if you live in an expensive area, an area that's hard to attract and retain professionals, you're going to have to pay them more to be in that area, to teach in that area. So it's just kind of a geographic cost estimator that differentiates for the average levels of compensation that you have to pay people in different areas.
May I follow up to that, please, Dave? So in looking at our state of New Hampshire here, and I live in Grafton County, to get the average wage of a police officer in Grafton County, of course, it's going to be highly influenced by Lebanon and Hanover. But you come up to my particular community, Haverhill, and we can't compete with that. But are we going to be funded based in this formula based upon the average or the amount that is set for Grafton County, or is it going to be more relative to what the actuality of this particular town?
These population, the staff price level variable is at what's called a metropolitan statistical area level, which is areas defined by the Census Bureau around certain metropolitan areas, or if there's not a metropolitan area, then it groups together places in rural areas. But regardless, in our model, we didn't find that this had hardly any impact. So we ended up dropping it from the weight estimation model, which is why it's not one of the weights that is being applied in the weights model. So it didn't have a big effect, and because it didn't have a big effect, we dropped it from the weights. So it's not one of the weights that we're applying.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Drew. Let's see, I see Chris has a hand up.
Well, that last part answered a number of my questions. I was confused about what effect it had in there, but I'm still confused about why include the efficiency values if they're really always going to be the same for all districts. What is that doing for us?
So we're applying them as if they're the same for all districts, but in actuality, they are different for districts. So when we enter them into as individual districts and we estimate the coefficients, So when we estimate the coefficients on this screen, it's accounting for the differences in efficiency across districts. But when we predict a cost, we're setting them all to the same. So a district that is more efficient, we're treating the same in terms of their predicted cost as a district that's less efficient. So it's the same idea as setting the outcome to the state average. We want to compensate districts as if they are able to achieve the same state outcome. We want to compensate districts as if they are achieving the same level of efficiency. We don't want to reward districts who are inefficient and spend more than they need to, because that would be counterproductive. We want to treat all districts as if they're operating under the same level of efficiency. I don't know if I explained that very well, but it's basically placing all districts on a level playing field in terms of their ability to achieve a given outcome with a common set of spending.
At the level for cost model estimation, but then when it's actually applied to an individual district, how does efficiency play in to the cost? Or does it?
Right, so we're treating districts as if they're operating under the same amount of efficiency. So we're not compensating districts based on these efficiency variables, which is why we set them to the state average for the prediction of costs, and why we don't include them in the weight estimation model. So we're basically accounting for them when we estimate the relationships between outcomes and spending and the relationships between student needs and outcomes. But then when we estimate the weights, which are used to dole out the dollars across districts, we're treating efficiency as constant. So we're not rewarding districts for being less efficient. We're not penalizing districts for being more efficient. Yeah.
Okay, I get that, but someone could. I mean, that's where some measures of accountability in a different way might come in.
Right. If we didn't account for these efficiency variables, then we might find that certain types of districts that are more likely to be inefficient would have higher spending than we're predicting. So by accounting for efficiency, we're trying to not reward districts for spending unnecessarily high amounts.
Okay. Does that address the question, Chris? Yeah. So said another way, Drew, does that mean that essentially the efficiency number ends up being part of the what's the term, residual, the artifact, or that $6,000 starting point that isn't soaked up by ELL, special education, enrollment, school size?
Right, yeah. So it's rolled into the constant term, exactly. So we're assuming that all districts have the same, are operating at the same starting point and for the constant term. So yeah, that ends up being rolled into that constant term.
Okay. And Corinne's got a hand up.
Oops, thanks, Dave. I have a question about the variables, but first just want to comment from a practitioner's point of view in terms of what Dick was talking about. I can certainly understand how, the costs are remarkably more than what districts have been getting. But I think that the base, from being in the trenches, from the base, it has really increased minimally compared to what the rate of actual cost has increased. And districts, I think, to be able to just keep up, have been forced to decrease program staffing and whatnot. And it's still, and I think it reached a breaking point, and maybe this is why we're where we are today. But my question really lies with what value does the share of the population ages 5 to 17, what does that matter in the formula? I'm not sure I understand why, if you have a percentage of the number of students, how is that very different than your enrollment numbers? I mean, I know they're different, but what does it have to contribute to the whole piece? Thanks.
So that's one of the 3 efficiency variables, along with federal revenue and the Herfindahl index. And Bruce Baker could explain this better than I have, but I mean, this is based on his work and some work of his mentors. But the efficiency variables are really trying to get at unexplained differences in spending across districts, or unexplained differences in outcomes across districts. So if you think about the incentives for certain districts to spend a lot on education, if you have a high percentage of your population that's of schooling age, you might be a district that's more willing to spend more on education. So, so that district might end up spending inefficiently if they decide they have a lot of kids in their district and they want to produce a high quality education for those kids. They might spend a lot on education. So these variables are trying to get at the unexplained differences in spending across districts that are unrelated to student outcomes. And like I said, these variables, we end up setting them to the state average amount. So they are intended to influence some of the relationships, the remaining relationships, for example, between free and reduced price lunch and student outcomes, or special education and student outcomes or spending. But they end up not being part of the reason why districts get more or less money in the end, because we set these variables to the state average. And there's actually a figure in the appendix of the report that explains a little bit more about these efficiency variables. And we projected spending if we allow them to vary. So if we allow efficiency to differ across districts versus holding efficiency constant across districts, and they really end up not contributing a whole lot to the overall differences in costs across districts. So they're there from a kind of theoretical standpoint that we should control for efficiency, and they end up not doing a ton in terms of altering district costs.
Right. Great. Thanks.
Thank you. Yep.
Thanks, Drew. So we're running about a half hour behind, but I think it's really important to get through Drew's presentation so that we can all have a better understanding of what went into and how the estimated cost model was arrived at. And so, Drew, I think back over to you to move us into the next part of this. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was all step 1 in the process, generating those initial cost predictions. So the next step is step 2, which is the estimation of weights. So how do we get from those cost predictions to weights? So the real purpose of this step 2 is to generate a simpler model that can be used in a formula to allocate funding across towns or across districts, and is easily updated on an annual basis. So we use the predicted costs from the prior cost model to estimate a simpler weight estimation model. And in the weight estimation model, we only included student needs, enrollment sizes, and grade shares. as I previously mentioned, the price of teachers variable didn't end up being significant, and so we dropped that because we didn't think it was necessary to include a weight on for that variable. And in this step, we can also exclude spending that wouldn't be allocated through a state allocation formula. So we exclude federal dollars, the special education catastrophic aid dollars, and we modeled with and without transportation to allow the commission the flexibility to decide whether they wanted to include or exclude transportation from the state formula.
Dave, this is Bill. Could I
Bill.
ask Drew right there, at that point where you're shifting from step 1 to step 2, which is the weights, the relationships that are developed in spending predictions by district in step 1, those relationships are preserved in your step 2 effort to produce a simpler model, right? So that the bottom line is the core of your work are the relationships between predicted costs by district that are produced by step 1. The development of these weights is just simply a way that we can consider putting in a statute, for example, a simpler model than the step 1 model that would allow the model to be, that the weighted model allows an actual aid package and other policy impacts to be generated each year thereafter until you redo the step 1 effort, maybe in 10 years or something. I just wanted to really start at the relationship between step 1, which produces the core result, the relationship between Bedford and Manchester. And now we're preserving that and constructing the weights of step 2. Am I right or wrong on that understanding?
Yes, that's right. So the relationships between free and reduced price lunch and costs, or in between special education and costs, et cetera, are all generated in step 1. They might change a little bit in step 2 based on the exclusion of these certain types of spending. For example, federal revenue is higher in high poverty districts. So by excluding that revenue, we're actually kind of reducing the relationship between free and reduced price lunch and cost a little bit. But yeah, the underlying relationships are established in step 1. And in step 2, we're just describing those relationships in a simpler way that is easily translated into a funding formula.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
You're welcome. So, so we take out the federal revenue in our examples. That amounts to about $1,500 in Manchester and $350 per student in Bedford. We take out the special education catastrophic aid. That amounted to about $40 in Manchester and $100 in Bedford per student. We can optionally take out transportation. You can see those dollar values there. And once we end up taking those dollars out, we end up with a little over $21,000 in Manchester, down from the almost $23,000, and $12,600 in Bedford, which is down a little bit, just a little bit from the original prediction. So now we're starting with these dollars amounts that exclude the funding that we want to exclude, and we're basically re-estimating a model with the factors that we want to include in a funding formula. And that's where we come up with these weights. And this is the weights after we've converted the regression model into weights. But the conversion of the regression model into weights is very simple. The base per pupil cost is just the constant term that's produced by the regression model. And then the weights are the dollar value difference for a given factor divided by the base per pupil cost. So it's a very simple conversion from the regression model to the weights. And in the final report, you can see both the regression output and the weights estimated, and you can see how those are calculated. but these weights are simply the best way, the best calculation, the most accurate calculation of those cost predictions that minimizes error, as we discussed in the regression model, to get back to those cost predictions. So these are the weights that both most accurately describe the cost in each district.
So Drew, I want to ask, well, I guess make a point on this, and I think you just made it, but I don't think we can overstate it. That the base per pupil cost that you've got on this slide is not to be sort of equated to the base cost of an adequate education or anything like that. This number is there because we're only really looking at 4 different factors of weights: free and reduced lunch, special education, English language learners, and enrollment data. If we had 10 weight categories or 20 weight categories or 100 weight categories, making this impossibly complicated, then that base per pupil cost would be significantly less, because you'd have more factors that you're piling onto it.
Right. So the more, yeah, exactly. The more factors you want to account for and the differentiation across districts, the more that's going to pull from the base and add dollars into the factors that are being differentiated for. So the base per pupil cost here represents the cost per student in a hypothetical district that had 0 for all of these values. So if they had no free and reduced price lunch students, no special education students, no English learners, they were in a district that had more than 2,000 students, they had no middle school students and no high school students, then that would cost $5,868 per student, according to our model. When we apply all the weights, we end up with an effective range of around $12,500 per student to around $30,000 per student, which is very similar to the actual range of spending across districts that currently exist in New Hampshire.
So said another way, as soon as you start to get students, then the cost per pupil changes dramatically, because the weights start to apply.
Yeah. Right. So in other words, yeah, even the lowest cost district, the lowest need district in New Hampshire, is about double the base per pupil cost, meaning that they have students in those weight categories that increase the base per pupil cost by about 2 times.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
So, yeah, take us through how this works.
Yeah, so these are just the calculations that are the application of the weights, and these are the same calculations that are in the simulator. So if you've looked through the calculations in the simulator, these are the same calculations here. So you apply the base, you apply the weights to each student need category. So for Manchester, the FRL weight is 1.49. The free and reduced price lunch rate is 58% or 0.58. So you multiply the weight times the rate for each category, and you end up with the per pupil dollar amount there. So you can see that after the application of weights, Manchester would be funded at $20,373, Bedford at $12,664. So those are pretty close to the per pupil cost that we had estimated previously. You can compare that to the $21,260 for Manchester after we excluded the federal revenue and catastrophic aid, and the $12,605 in Bedford. So these weights are the weights that across all districts best approximate the estimated cost that we came up with. And just as a kind of measure of the precision that the weights have. The R-squared value, which is a measure of model fit in regression, is 0.982, which means 98.2% of the variation in predicted costs are accounted by the factors or the weights included in the weight estimation model. That ranges from 0 to 1. So you can't get a whole lot closer to 1 there. So our weights are doing a very good job of predicting the costs, or of estimating the costs that we predicted from the cost model.
Great questions for Drew. I see a couple of hands up. Iris, then, sorry, Jane, then Iris. And then
Great.
Val.
Thank you, Dave. Drew, can you just confirm for me in terms of, as we look at the special ed weight, we've been talking about ages 5 to 17. Could you just confirm that it does not include that 3 to 5 age range that school districts are required to serve for kids with disabilities, as well as the 18 to 21-year-old? Is that taken into, both of those areas taken into consideration?
So in the simulator, the special ed ADM is pulled from the state's existing adequacy cost calculation formula. And my understanding is that it only applies through to grades K to 12. But some of the other commissioners who have worked with that adequacy formula for many years might have a better understanding than I do.
Thank you. So that may be something
right.
that, those are two areas that can be very costly for school districts. They tend to be pretty costly.
Drew, if I can jump in, Jane, just to answer. I mean, I think that you're right about the 3 to 5. But Drew, I think that because 18 to 21 still hasn't graduated, that population is counted.
Okay, I'll take your word for it, Jay. I mean, it's what the data is, and so I don't know all of the exactly what goes into the data. That might be a question for the Department of Ed to better understand how that is calculated specifically.
So Jay, you're talking about on the DOE 25 not being broken out by in the 18 to 21.
I don't think it's broken up by,
Yeah.
I don't think the age is influencing the student population at that point.
Yeah, so basically it's all in.
I believe.
Yeah. Jane, is that about right?
I think as a commission, as long as we've got the data to prove that we're right, we're good. Especially if we're looking at, in New Hampshire, increasing the age for services to 22. All important information for us to be considering. And when questioned, having the data from the department that it is, yes, included or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Well, they're included in the ADMA, right? The 21-year-old?
I don't know that for sure. That's why I'm raising the question.
No, we need to confirm that. We can.
Okay, okay.
Thanks.
Am I up?
Let's see, Iris, you're up. Yeah, sorry, I was just taking a note. Yep.
Okay, thanks. When we were discussing these weights in the adequacy work group and trying to determine whether we are moving forward with them as they were proposed, there was some discussion that they needed to be considered as a whole package. Some of us continue to have concerns about weightings for small schools and the way in which special education was weighted as one lump rather than in categories. We've since learned from Doug Hall's public comment that it is possible to differentiate special ed into categories of cost. So I'm wondering, going forward, isn't it possible to change some of the weights and redirect within the whole approach that funding to other weights that have been identified?
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. I would just, yeah. So, I mean, if we talk about step one of this process and step two being independent processes, so step one is really used to generate the predicted cost in each district. And step two is used to estimate the weights that would best describe the cost in each district. And in step two, you can make decisions about which weights to include or not include in the weight estimation model. And so you could, for example, drop the small schools weight or drop the middle school enrollment weight, and you could see how the rest of the weights shake out. So it wouldn't change the predicted cost in the first step, but it would change what weights are picking up the variation in the second step.
You know, and Drew, I think it's also worth saying that with essentially 4 weights, you're getting to a, what, 98 point something % accuracy to the
Right.
step one estimated costs based
Yeah.
on the FY19 act, you know.
And so each time you drop one of those weights, that accuracy will go down a little bit. So that might be something you would want to look at, or we would want to consider. If you dropped middle school and that went from 98 to 75%, that would indicate that middle school is actually a pretty important weight in predicting the cost. But if it only dropped down to 97%, maybe that wouldn't be that big of a deal. So that's something we would want to think about if we made any of those changes in the step 2 model.
Right, and I think that same thing also applies, well, like you said, to the middle school, you know, aspect of it too. That at the end of the day, the weights, you know, applied to the ADM to get as close as possible to the step 1 estimated costs are really the important thing, and you know, and so nobody's really losing out. You know, if we're all in agreement of the step 1 cost, step 2 is really how to model that in a simple expression. So
yeah, that's right.
So Val, I got you up next.
Yeah, I just you know, had the question, like the R squared here is 0.982, which is quite high. But if I go back to step 1, the R squared is 0.377. So that's telling us effectively that our regression analysis only accounts for 37.7% of the variation. Is that correct?
Yes, in step 1, that's correct. So there are certain factors that, or just errors in the data that are either random or are explained by factors that we're not including that do explain the variation in spending across districts. So I think we could, yeah, if we included more predictors in the first equation, we could increase that R squared value. But the question is whether the predictors that we include in the first equation make sense to include as predictors that would then drive differences in funding across districts. So like I said, as an example earlier, we could include, for example, average teacher salaries, the actual average teacher salaries in districts, and that would be highly predictive of overall spending in districts. But do you want to reward districts that are currently paying their teachers a lot? I don't think so, because if they're currently paying their teachers a lot, then that means they're probably also currently spending a lot. So we want to include factors in that first stage model that would reasonably be included in a cost model, in a cost formula, a state funding model, and not include factors that kind of perversely incentivize spending more in already higher spending districts. So the things that we want to include in the cost model are things that are outside of the district's control and that reasonably drive differences in cost. So the things that we include are the typical cost factors: student needs, price of input, price of labor that is exogenous, that's not just based on district decisions, but based on the circumstances of where they're located, and the scale of operation. So those are the usual three, and those are the three that we've included. So I'm not sure what else we would include. There could be different student needs variables for sure that we include that might help explain more, but beyond that, I'm not sure what else we would want to include in the first stage model.
Does that help, Val?
Yep.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Do we have more on the? This is the last slide in this pack.
Yes, this is the last slide.
So are there any final questions to Drew? And I think what Val just brought up was really important. That the and what Drew was really explaining, that it's that step one is so critical to really understand and have a high degree of confidence in step one, especially when and we all knew this going into it, that spending across districts was all over the place. And so there's no way you can draw a straight line. This is going back to the first slide, right, Drew? There's no way where you're going to be able to draw a straight line and have all the districts right there on the line. They're going to be well above and well below at all, along the entire x-axis. So so finding a way to represent that with a straight line is going to be error prone, and like Drew said, he threw out they did not use a lot of the factors that contribute to that error, like variations in teacher salaries. So having a high degree of confidence in step one is really important. In step two, you can see how the pretty straightforward set of 4 weights applied against the ADM basically reproduce those estimated costs very, very accurately. So and you'd expect that in the step 2 approach.
Yep.
So sort of like what we've said over the last few weeks, really, I think all our emphasis needs to be on the understanding and confidence in the step one, because step 2 reproduces that really well. And why do we need to reproduce it? Because we're not going to go through this again this was done for FY9 based on FY19 DOE data that we had at the time the research began. We're not going to do it again with the FY20 DOE data and FY21. But if we want to, put together a budget in a few months that talks about school funding in FY22 and FY23, we're going to need to have a model like in step 2 in order to get there. So.
And Dave, to that point, a concluding point is that what Drew and AIR have brought to the table is their expertise. This step 1 model, which, as you say, needs to be credible to not only members of this commission, but also to the public. The credibility is based to a great extent on the expertise, academic and other skills of the AIR team. This model, predicted cost model based on outcomes, is not dreamed up just for New Hampshire and our report. As the AIR report indicated, it's based on substantial academic work, unless, Drew, I'm wrong, but that Bruce Baker has done, Jesse Levin, Drew Atchison, we are relying on the credibility of their expertise to a great extent. and in our own judgments that the relationships that their model produce between Manchester and other towns make sense. That, you know, that's the gut level test. None of us individually, as Bruce Mallory pointed out, may be able to reproduce the regression analysis, but we don't really need to. The question we need to ask Drew is this a credible model based on substantial academic work and knowledge and technical expertise brought to New Hampshire data?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And I think one of the things that we did that I didn't discuss here was we also ran a regional model that included multiple states in the New England area, and the regional model produced very similar results to our New Hampshire specific model. And so I think that allows us to have more confidence in the New Hampshire specific model.
Yeah, if I can, I mean, and to underscore these last few points, these factors are relevant in a whole variety of state funding formulas. It's not like these were just made up of whole cloth. We from the first presentations we saw from Education Commission of the States and National Council of State Legislatures, they pointed to these same variables. In fact, our current state funding formula, when it comes to differentiated aid, uses these factors to differentiate. I think the only surprise that there is here is that rather than having an extra weight for elementary students, this is showing that the higher costs are not for elementary students. That's the only directional change that there is in this formula, and the weights are giving us more accuracy as to how it influences outcomes. So I think we have not just an expert team that has advised us, but we've got a lot of basis both within our state and nationally to find a rationale for this basis to try to differentiate need across our state.
Right. Really well said, Jay. Thanks. Is there anybody else that would like to put out a question or share a thought while we've got Drew on the line with us? Rick.
Thank you very much, Dave. I still trying to wrap my head around this step one of the process, but in step two, we're looking at weighted categories, which are very similar, with the exception of the enrollment categories, to what we have in current law, or at least what we've strived to do. But the special education weight of 4.29 plus, you know, the base amount, which is 5868, multiplied times that percentage or whatever you got in your school district, is basically making the statement that every special education student is the same. And I don't think that's the case. We have some students which are on the way out the door that are being monitored, and then we have other students that are very expensive and full-time job specialists, the whole 9 yards. Has any model that uses these weights tried to find an average weight to use for special education, which is not going to be necessarily a 4.29 for a kid that's basically receiving very little service and maybe exiting out the door in another 4 months' time?
I think these weights are averages, and well, I mean, I won't say I think they are averages. They are averages. So the weights represent the average cost for special education. They represent the average cost for free and reduced price lunch. And it's not saying that every special education student is going to cost the same, but if you average these the cost of special education in a district, then that's what they would cost on average. So some of the lower need special education students will cost far less than that. Some of the higher need special education students will cost far more than that. And hopefully on average, districts are able to spread the costs around so that they can serve all their special education students. And I would also point out that these costs exclude the cost of catastrophic aid, which can serve those high need students that districts are unprepared to serve based on this average weight. So if districts have a particularly high need student and these weights are not enough to compensate the district for that student, they can still use the special education catastrophic aid to get some additional state revenue for those particularly high need students.
But with the average cost, according to this formula, based upon the outcomes, which is going to be much more per pupil than we're spending now, CAD aid is not going to kick in for a significant time, seeing that if you're going to multiply 3.5, which is 3.5 times the student now, it's not going to kick in. I think if we're going to change something here, we're going to have to change CAD aid also.
So you're sort of drawing an equivalency here, Rick, which doesn't work. So the cost of inadequate education as laid out in 198.40 is not what the estimated cost model is, right?
No, it's not.
So,
I agree.
So the estimated cost model is based on our actual FY19 costs, and the average total all-in average statewide per pupil cost in the estimated cost model is exactly what New Hampshire spent all in state and local sources in FY19 for all students. It's got nothing to do with 198.40, cost of inadequate education.
I think for me, Dave, I don't want to take up all the time here. I just have a problem even with step one, where we're basing it on an average that we want to see attain based upon our current spending in accordance with DOE 25. Some districts are teaching PK right now, and that's part of their costs. Others are not. So we've taken, some districts are doing this, some districts are not, and we're putting that all together and we're coming up with an average. If we were truly going to come up with an average, we'd have every district doing the pre-K, but we don't know that because we're averaging out apples and oranges. I don't have a football team, for example, in this district, but they certainly have that expense, and that's part of the costs.
Right. So Rick, I think this is an adequacy, a cost of adequacy discussion.
Okay.
No, I absolutely hear what you're saying. Absolutely understand what you're saying, but that's different than the estimated cost model.
Well, you're gonna have to convince me that it's somehow linked.
It clearly what districts are spending right now.
Yeah.
Based on what we all know, what Corrine talked about 45 minutes ago is not the money that's laid out in 198:40.
Right.
So adequacy is something different than, doesn't have to be, but it's something different than what districts are spending. So Bruce, I saw you had your hand up and I wanted to take this interrupt. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just, we do need to move on, and this is a really important discussion. So let's make sure that we've really brought it to a close. But my question for Drew, and I think is a way of actually building on the exchange that Dave and Rick just had. Drew, can you help the group understand, and me and the group understand, why we cannot take the current base adequacy costs that the legislature has generated, and DOE has generated, which for last fiscal year was $3,709, I believe, which is referred to as base adequacy, and the base per pupil cost in your model, which is 5,800 plus, including transportation, those are two really very different representations of cost. And so could you, Drew, in your language, explain why it would really be a mistake for anybody to say, oh, we're just simply increasing base adequacy from $3,700 to $5,800 plus weights, and that's a really that would be a mistaken kind of comparison. And then I have a technical question for you, and then one last comment.
Sure.
And then Jay.
So I think that the main difference in the formulas is in the amount that's allocated through the weights. And so as we discussed previously, when Dave made his point that if you kept adding variables into the formula, you would reduce the base cost more and more. So the real difference is in how much is being allocated through the weights versus how much is being allocated through the base. And so the bases in the two formulas might be relatively comparable, but in the new formula, the proposed formula, far more is allocated through the weights. And so you end up with a far higher average spending amount through this formula compared to the prior formula, which only allocates a sliver through the weights, and the bulk of it is through the base cost. So if you play around with the simulator and you set all the weights to 0, then you'll end up with a base cost of $17,000, which is the state average cost. So the goal or how we've set up this formula, and I think which is part of the challenge that the commission is having with it, is that it does allocate all of the dollars, or the bulk of the dollars, minus a few programs on the side, the federal programs and the catastrophic aid. It is intended to allocate all of the remaining dollars through this formula. And I think that's a big shift from what has historically happened in New Hampshire, where almost 70% of the dollars have been through the local revenue, and only about 30% have been through the state formula. So this is a big shift in terms of where, and I'm also not saying that all of the money has to come from the state coffers here, but it's accounted for in the formula. Whether that comes from state revenues or local revenues is a separate discussion, but the formula accounts for all of that money.
And by having so much more, a greater proportion of the total cost assigned to weights, that actually results in targeting the distribution of funds to local districts depending on the characteristics of their students. So it's a much closer alignment between student needs and the amount that gets distributed out to the districts is the consequence of the model. Technical question, and I know you're aware of this, and we'll thank Doug Hall again for bringing this to our attention. Remind us of how the middle grade weights were treated relative to type of school, something called a quote middle school, which might have 5 to 8, it might have 6 to 8, it might have 4 to 7, versus the students that are actually assigned to those grades, and what the data was that you used for that.
Yeah. So in the actual cost model, which relies on district level data because we need student outcomes and district level spending in the cost model. So that's district level data. We were able to obtain data that had the breakout of enrollments at specific grade levels. So when we're talking about a middle school enrollment for the purposes of the cost model, we're talking about the proportion of students in grades 6 through 8, okay, not whether they are in a middle school building or a K to 8 building or a 6 to 8 or a 6 to 12 building. The challenge then is in the simulator, when we convert from district level data to town level data, right, we do not have the analogous data to calculate the proportion of students in grades 6 through 8. We only have the data that the Department of Education produces that has the Department of Education classification of enrollment into middle grades or middle schools and high schools, as the Department of Education defines it. So we have that at the town level, which is not the same as the proportion of students in 6 through 8. So moving forward, I would recommend that the department or that the commission work with the department to calculate the proportion of enrollments in grades 6 through 8 and in grades 9 through 12 at the town level. So that might be an additional data requirement when applying this formula to the town level.
Yeah, and the fact that there's some 5th graders in something called a middle school is just a function of local choice. And right now the model's not going to account for them, but it has no significant consequence at this point, I think is.
Yeah, it does not affect our calculated weights. It does affect the allocation of dollars according to the simulator.
Yeah. Last comment that I'll make, and then I'll pass it on. But I wanted to acknowledge that we did get a few some questions from the attendees, and I think it's worth commenting on now because I expect others have these same questions in their minds. And that is, what is it about the state average achievement levels that that the commission is considering? Right now, we work with 3 variables in order to identify those Z outcome scores. And then we call that average state achievement that we're trying to help all students have an opportunity to achieve. And so I just wanted to say for folks' information that the commission has that question in mind. For example, should in our report to the legislature recommend that different or additional performance measures be included against which then to calculate costs and to, in a sense, hold districts accountable for trying to achieve at least statewide averages for their students, and how do they support that? So there are lots of ways to measure outcomes here besides test scores, as we acknowledge. Right now, again, we work with the data that we have, we work with the policies that we have. This is where it's led us to the analysis today. But I think it remains an open question for the commission about whether those outcome measures are the ones that are most useful and most appropriate for the state to use. So that's just wanted to comment on that. So I think Jay had a comment, and then Dave, I'm going to suggest that after Jay and maybe any others, we take a 5-minute stretch break since we still have some more work to do.
Right. So Jay, you're up.
Thank you. And it's just to acknowledge, and let me try with the grade levels. I mean, while you've proportioned the grade levels in a district back to the towns in the same level as their enrollment, I mean, the actual error in that is pretty minimal, right?
I think it depends on the town. I mean, we could look at different ways of doing that for the purpose of the simulator. So right now we've used the districts or the Department of Education's data that categorizes enrollment as middle school or high school. And if there's a small town that has a K-8 school and all of that middle enrollment is identified as elementary enrollment, then that could have an effect on, or that does have an effect on the amount of funding that town would get. So we could, if the Department of Education comes back and says there's no way that we can calculate that at the town level, and if that's what's required for the funding formula, then there's different options that we could take to see to calculate a middle school enrollment and a high school enrollment. We could take the district level enrollment and try to apportion that back to towns, but there will be some error in that too. So, and it's hard to tell how much error there would be, but so the challenge is with it for the towns. I'll just leave it there, but I wouldn't be too concerned with it at this point. It's just for the purpose of the simulator at this point. And like I said, it doesn't affect the actual weights estimated. So it's really the application of the weights to the funding. And I think there's some time to figure that out with work with the Department of Education and work with the legislative analysts to figure that out.
Let me try on the special education so that we don't get keep asking ourselves a question that I think you've answered, and I recognize that there's. But let's try the 3 to 5 year old question one more time. That while that may be a part of a district's overall spending, that when that enrollment isn't counted, the town and the district aren't getting credit for that spending back in the formula. I mean,
Yeah.
did I just explain that correctly?
That's right. So, and my understanding of the way that the formula works currently is that the towns aren't getting credit for any pre-K enrollment in the formula.
Right.
So I think that's an open question and something that AIR, in conversation with commission leadership, decided to punt on, because that's a bigger question than we were prepared to answer. But I think it would, in our cost model, we did include pre-K enrollment in our calculation of weights, and we did include spending, overall spending at the district level. So if it was decided that pre-K should be included, then they would be treated just as any other elementary student, and receive the weights in conjunction to their enrollment.
All right. So relative to the error factor really has been minimized on that pre-K. You've taken out both the cost and the enrollment, and so what's left in the simulator is with both sides of that equation removed.
Yeah, that's right. So it's just a matter of doling out the dollars, and right now the dollars aren't being doled out for the pre-K students. Yeah. But if you wanted to, then that would be an easy thing to add.
Yeah, and in the same sense, the catastrophic aid has been all backed out from school spending as well, right?
Yep.
So, the slight imprecision is that we don't have the breakdown of students in the less than 3.5 times the. Anyway, we don't have the breakdown of special education students in the more discrete categories. That's otherwise we've got this as well treated as we could to isolate just those costs that school districts are covering without supplemental aid, either for the younger or the in-school populations. I mean, sorry, that was long, but
yeah,
I'm feeling, Rick, I'm going through that just so that we're comfortable that I think AIR has done a good job of trying to back out the ambiguities that there are, with this one exception that we've got one category from, that's a part of adequacy costs.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So thanks, Jay. Drew, I've got a final question for you too. How would we go about determining what the change would be to the estimated cost model if we wanted to take a different assumption as far as equitable outcomes? So right now we're assuming state average outcome, and all the estimated costs are basically based on that. But what if we wanted to look at something like 1 standard deviation above current state average, what would be the effect on the estimated cost model? Or one standard deviation below the state average, what would be the effect? And numbers in between or beyond those, is it a linear type of effect or what?
Yeah, it doesn't change the weights at all. It will only change the base. So the base will go up if you want to if you want to achieve a higher outcome, and the base will go down if you want to achieve a lower outcome. And that's worked into the simulator. So in the simulator, there's a toggle that allows you to change the state outcome to whatever outcome you want. So you can see how that affects spending in the simulator. But yeah, it only affects the base. And I think our cost model indicates that a 1 standard deviation change in outcomes increases cost by about 17 or 18%.
Okay, great. All right, I know I'm getting the hook from Bruce here. Are there any final? I'm sure Drew's going to be back with us for more stuff down the road, but are we
coming back here?
Yeah, are we simulated out? Are we done with simulator questions and estimated cost model questions as far as today? Sort of chew on what we've learned. And Rick.
Yeah, I'd like to just, maybe Drew can get this for us. Can he get some more specific information about what 1 standard deviation, as you're just talking about here, either up or down, is it 17 or 18, or is it percent, or can you give us something specific as, you know, as 17.5%, so that if we do start messing around, we can easily figure that out?
Yeah, and I think we put in 17.5% in the simulator. So I think that is the right number there. So yeah, 17.5%.
Okay, great, perfect. Great, Drew, our thanks as always for your time and assistance on this. And if anybody's got more questions that come up later tonight, or when you're working on something else, small engine repair, whatever,
Sure.
you know, floats your boat. That's what I'm deep into right now. Just email them to me or Bruce, and we'll get them over to Drew and try to get them fielded. So, and we'll make sure everybody gets a copy, and we'll make sure it's put up on the website too, so everybody can see. So is that fair enough?
Works
All right.
for me.
Great, Drew. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
Stick around.
All right.
I know you'll enjoy this. Dave, what if we give, let's see here, people have been patient and good, so let's give them 7 minutes and say at 3:20, everybody back here on screen, ready to go for the rest of our agenda.
Sounds good.
I know
All right.
we're going until 4:30, so thanks everybody.
7-minute break.
3:20.
Yep. Good. So Bruce.
Oops, yeah.
I was just sort of looking at the agenda.
Yeah.
Do we want to do, like, rather than 30-minute each, do like 10-minute each or 5-minute each?
Well, you know, I think engagement is going to just be a report out. So I think engagement's going to be less than 10 minutes. And we probably should plan on at least walking through those points in adequacy and fiscal policy, roughly 10 minutes each. So that puts us at roughly a half an hour, 3:45. No, I think we're fine. I think we're doing okay, because we're going to 4:30. Well, we're going to go to 4:15 for public comments, right? So a little less than an hour.
Right.
So yeah, about 10 minutes for each of the work group updates, and then we'll have time just to talk a little bit, just to sort of introduce the final report structure. I'll share the screen and show people what that looks like. we have that one slide that you asked me to put together about writing the categorical aid briefs. Show that in terms of assignments. I've got that key questions remaining document. I can just kind of show it up here for a second. It's got 28 questions or something on it. So,
the other thing we could do too is if Thursday we're already noticed for adequacy and fiscal policy.
Yeah, we are.
We could reserve that time, take some time there to go through these.
That would make more sense, those questions, because they really are adequacy and fiscal policy questions anyway.
Yeah. Well, to go through the questions or to go through the work group updates?
Well, I think it'd be good to just walk through these updates today. But we have a different audience. This gets recorded differently. So let's, at least for the record, identify where each of these work groups is right now.
Yeah. Because I do like the full. I like the idea of the full commission sort of weighing in on key questions so that they know what the work groups are going to be taking up and then bringing forward to our meetings over the next few weeks.
Well, I can send the document out to everybody right now as well, because it's a little bit awkward to all that text on a screen. But I'll share the screen also for the sake of our audiences and so on.
Yeah.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, Rick.
I have in my hands right here, you can't read it, so I'll just explain what it is. There was once a report that came from the districts to the Department of Education, and the last one I got is 2006. It's a statewide census for by disability. And it lists out all the disabilities going across the top and the number of kids in each district which are that have that disability. Then it compiles it and gives an aggregate for the state, which shows the program types, whether it's home-based programming, individual non-school, resource room programming, self-contained programming, modified regular ed programming. And it's very interesting where we find that 81% back then were in a modified homeroom mainstreamed environment. And when it came to the resource room, only 8%. Self-contained, 10%. I'd like to see what that is today and like to know from DOE, why did this stop? Because we've said earlier on the commission here, we haven't been able to access this information. It was
but you've got that down to the district level, right?
I've got the aggregate right here for the state.
Oh, it's aggregate for the state.
For the state, and of which the district has to submit this stuff. So that was also available. I haven't gone out and gotten it by district, but I've got the aggregate.
That might, if I don't know if Jane, maybe when Jane gets back, maybe we can ask her if.
Yeah, this is also on the DOE website. It's down deep. You got to go find it. But it stops at 2006.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
You can get every year preceding that, but in 2006 it stopped.
Yeah. Well, the DOE certainly has, they certainly have collect that information, so.
Yeah, they've got it.
Yeah, because they have to build, they obviously build out a, redact or a suppressed categorical aid, special education aid report.
Yeah.
No. All right, 2 minutes.
And that form also, Dave, included ages 3 through 21.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Rick, did you get the sense that based on what Drew said about the one standard deviation equaling 17.5%, that would also mean two standard deviations is 35%?
I might assume that, but in looking at when I'm talking about standard deviations in terms of intelligence and all that, if you're looking at the bell curve, it's not always equal.
Yeah, well, at some point it's got to break because
exactly.
you don't get to 100%, and I mean, what does that mean?
Yeah, I'd like to see the whole thing on the bell curve and see where the costs are along that line.
Yeah. I mean, I could see maybe the first standard deviation being 17.5%.
Yeah.
But the second standard deviation might be 22%.
Exactly. It's not going to be the same.
Yeah.
It can't be.
Right. Because the closer you get to the bone, the more you chip away. There's.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, and the end works in the other direction too.
It does. It does. We used to use that all the time when we were looking at our kids we had about 6 or 7 criteria for being gifted. And we had one kid that came across the board once in school that had 148 IQ. He could think circles around anybody who was giving him the test.
Mm.
And then, of course, you have the opposite side too. And see, this is one of the things that does bother me along the way is that we provide all the services, which we should, for the child who needs it on the left-hand side, but on the right-hand side, it takes just as much effort to get that really gifted kid where they belong too. And special education in a lot of states incorporates monies for gifted. We don't. We basically depend upon competencies.
Dave, I was looking on the spreadsheet, the simulator, and on that toggle that's there for average outcome, where we can go up or down. And I didn't see the exact sort of, it sounded like Drew thought there was on the simulator a 17.5%.
No, I think you can plug in
standard
a
deviation of 1 that equated to 17.5%. A little bit above and a little bit below. Not that it's terribly important, but that's what I'm finding.
So on the simulator, you're seeing that you can select the standard deviation or the z-score you want?
No, what you do is you select the assumed outcome level. That's toggled by 5 percentile points across, the whole spread. And when you choose one of those, there's another line that tells you the standard deviation relative to average.
Okay. Good. All right. So I think we're back. And just before, or I guess right as we started the break, we were talking about heading into the next section, which is to get brief work group updates. I think we're going to start with engagement and then adequacy and then fiscal policy. And very brief updates, not 30 minutes each, more like 5, 7 minutes each, something like that. So we'll try to keep it to that, and then we're going to have we've got work group scheduled for Thursday this week, beginning at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then so a 10 to noon block, a 1 to 3 block, and a 3 to 5 block, and we could certainly use those for more in-depth updates maybe at the top of each work group. But let's we'll keep this meeting going, and we'll start with engagement. So Mel.
Dum, da-da-dum, da-dum-dum. All right, so I think Carrie has a visual that she's going to put up on the screen. We have received this is an example of what we've been doing so far. And we have a variety of reports that are in the process of being finalized, which we are going to review at our Thursday meeting. You'll see that we have received the Granite State poll from UNH. We had 1,030 who were engaged in that survey, and there's some very rich information there. At our work group meeting on Thursday, we are going to have persons from the survey center to really go deep into the results, and look at all the crosstabs, et cetera, that will give us an idea of exactly what it means beyond just what a percent was on a particular response. We will also then have at our next commission meeting representatives from the survey that will also be able to answer questions from the commissioners, et cetera. The survey is very detailed. It's got a lot of good information. It is available online for commission members to look at it in advance before our meeting. Carrie, any other comments, or Bruce, any other comments on the actual survey itself without getting into the detail of it?
Not right now. Yeah, just the dates you mentioned in terms of a presentation.
Okay.
Important to remember.
So then we also have, Carrie, we're also in the process of developing a crosswalk between all of the engagement opportunities that we've had so far, and to come up with some common themes that are, and there are common themes that are coming across through the various engagement experiences that we have had. You'll note here the dates that are coming up in the next week or so, and we will be able to provide the commissioners with a cross look at what these groups are basically saying, and look at the themes as we begin to look at how these themes can impact the decision-making that we're going to have. As we look at one of the meetings that we're going to have with new legislators, we need to coordinate that meeting with the Speaker's office and with the President of the Senate's office to make sure that there's a lot of orientation pieces that go on with after the election, and we want to make sure that we have a chance to coordinate that activity with them. Along with that, we are in the process of creating a packet of information that can be used. One of the things that did come across in the survey, not surprising to anybody, but that nobody really understands how this whole school funding thing works. And so one of the things that we're trying to develop is a packet of information similar to what Chris did with her group in Portsmouth, in taking some of the data that AIR has, some of the graphics that are there that demonstrate some of the issues that we've been talking about as a commission. And we hope to have that done in the next 3 weeks so that you can, if you want to go out and talk with folks, if we want to be able, there'll be really talking points and how to explain what we're trying to do. Because we can't have Drew at every one of our meetings that we have. So hopefully these will be able to be self-explanatory, and we can use those with a variety of different groups. So that's kind of a brief summary, David.
Right. Thanks, Mel. Anything, any questions or thoughts you want to share with Mel on this?
One of the things we did find is that the students that we've talked with have a very interesting perspective on the school funding stuff, and they understand the difference between a West High School, for example, and a Bedford High School. The kids talk to one another, and so as they begin to look at the issues of what opportunities they have available in their schools, I mean, one of the students said we more teachers so we can have more options to choose from in school, vis-a-vis that of a Pinkerton Academy, for example. And so we cannot dismiss what students are saying too, as well as others that are saying, but I think you'll begin to find there's a theme that's beginning, several themes that are beginning to develop that will help provide a foundation for the decision-making that we're going to have to make in some of our final conversations as a commission.
Great. Thanks, Mel. So Jay, you want to do a quick update on adequacy?
Sorry, Bruce, I don't know when you want to switch to the questions, but I'm willing to go through, in particular, those that relate to adequacy here, because what I like about the questions that just were in your emails, Bruce made note of that. So we just received. I'm fortunate I get two computers here. That the questions we're still addressing. So question 3 under that category is, what is the base adequacy formula amount, and should it include transportation? So I think we've just gone through, and I'll refer you back to the AIR report, tables 22 and 23. But we've just talked about, okay, base adequacy is really an outcomes-based formula. That cost of an average student to achieve those average outcomes is right around $17,000 per student. We have, and in the work group, said that the formula should be treated as a whole, and the transportation should not become something that is more categorical aid. So just to say, base adequacy has both a base amount and it has differentiated aid. And that is, when David was making mention of what is in the RSA 198.40, which is the allocation formula that gets updated every 2 years. The basic elements are there, and we could probably tie much of what are the recommendations of this committee to that formula. But in any case, relative to transfer, so we've got a base, we've got differentiated aid, and within that overall funding is transportation. We believe that if that is going to be addressed with future data needs, that perhaps that ought to recommend that a legislative study committee be established to identify some ways that other states have addressed differentiating on transportation aid. But at this point, no members of the adequacy committee recommend anything other than leaving it in as part of the total cost. So that's where we are with answering question number 3. Relative to answering question 4, what are the desired weights and the differentials that we should have? Well, I think we had a great description of that just now from Drew, and they are summarized in the AIR report in table 22 and 23. 23 has the actual weights that are included. So and the committee has raised questions about, can we answer the questions about grade level and district size? And hopefully today and in past session, we've had answers to those questions. On district size variables, we've got the slope model that that Drew produced at our request, that takes the incentive away from just landing one student one side or the other of a step. and hopefully on the grade level distribution back down to the town, we understand that issue better as a result of today's discussion. And then relative to, I don't need to go through all of these, but relative to the categorical aid areas, that which deal with pre-K, building aid, special education, and charter schools, those we've now assigned out to a couple of commission members to work alongside our Carsey lead folks, Bruce and Jordan, to begin to develop some text around those categorical aid recommendations. Those will accompany what we recommend in our final report. So part of my recommendation today is maybe adequacy's meeting on this Thursday, and I'll leave this for others to discuss. I don't know how urgent it is without having the new information that I think Bruce has suggested. We have some of those drafts available to us by October 26th. That would mean that the subcommittee or the work group would take a look at those categorical aid recommendations at its October 30th meeting, and the full commission would talk about those on November 2nd. So that's the pace at which we're going. And yeah, if anyone's got questions, any work group members want to chime in. David, I turn it back to you.
All righty. Thank you very much, Jay. And I'm just going to be real quick on fiscal policy. I just want to see what we've got on the agenda. So, you know, I think the first item is certainly a big question. I think we had quite a discussion on first last dollar, actually at an adequacy work group meeting. Last week, I think, and or maybe the week before, and you know, and I think while the state Supreme Court has has rendered decisions that indicate that the state is responsible for the first and last dollar of the cost of the cost of the opportunity for an adequate education. I think we're interested in taking a look at how both combination of adequacy and targeted grants can be done to achieve equitable outcomes both for students and taxpayers. And so we're not not taking a position on that. The courts, I think, are very well capable of taking their position and holding the state accountable for its responsibilities. But I think just as far as exploring what the various options are going to do, I think that's what we're interested in doing in fiscal policy. So that's still a big question there. We had a presentation last week on from Chair Alice Peisch from Massachusetts, who chairs the House Education Committee, to really sort of bring us up to date and introduce us to the way Massachusetts is funding education, and really they're right at the beginning of a new approach to it. And FY21, so the school year we're in right now, is the very first year of a 7-year phase-in of a new funding plan for Massachusetts. In its first year, they're basically funding it with 1/7 the amount that they expect to be funding it in the seventh year of the phase in. Every year in the budget, the budget will set what the overall state share and what the overall minimum effort would be. I'm sorry, and what the overall minimum amount would be for every school district. This is quite a bit different than what New Hampshire does. And in the first year, I think they set the state share as 41%, but it wasn't, honestly, it wasn't clear to me if that was going to remain 41% every year, or if that was going to change. Based on what Chair Peisch said, based on what Massachusetts has in their PowerPoint slide deck, it looks like that's up to the legislature each year. But they had a couple of very interesting points in there that I think were worth basing. First of all, it's very much a targeted approach. So while 41% was the overall share, by city and town, it ranges anywhere from 17% to a 90% share of the public education costs in those districts. So it's very much targeted, and I think it's targeted based on using both income and equalized property value per pupil. So at least a couple of things that we've talked about. They also roll in a hold harmless provision. So in a subsequent year, they will not receive any less in state funds than they have the previous year. They look at essentially the same factors we're looking at in our weighted estimated cost model: low income, ELL, and special education as being the primary weight drivers. And currently they're and they also weight based on concentrations, which is something that Iris has brought up, and but was, I think, considered by the AIR team and found not to be a factor in New Hampshire, but it certainly was found to be a factor in Massachusetts. And currently their foundation funding is around $13,000, and their actual is currently around $19,000. So they've got a lot of the same dilemmas and challenges that we have as far as that. That's basically from my notes on the Mass thing. Jordan, did you have any other things on the Mass 70?
No, I thought that was a good overview. I think, the implications for, tying it into the first and last dollar conversation, just thinking about there are different ways to set what is the appropriate state share versus the appropriate local share for K-12 funding. I thought that was an interesting difference between what New Hampshire does. Obviously, there's Supreme Court language pushing New Hampshire in the first last dollar discussion, but other states do it differently. So I thought that was just interesting as we think about that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And thanks, Jordan. And Bill, I just wanted to reach out to you on this because I know you were you were at the fiscal policy work group when the presentation was made, and you and Dick have certainly spent a lot of time on the what Massachusetts has been going through, but I wanted to give you guys a chance to add anything onto the Mass 70.
First, I'll just say that the Massachusetts representative was remarkably gracious with her time and was an expert at very high levels, it seems to me, in school finance issues. And it was very, very helpful to hear. I think that, the question, and Jordan and your explanation is right, that comes out is and Dick has brought this up as well, is assume that New Hampshire were to say, wow, that Massachusetts system looks really good with its foundation budget, with its mandatory minimum tax, with its state financing support. The question comes up as to whether that system would violate the so-called first and last dollar rule, which would mean that New Hampshire is remarkably constricted in the ability to address the problem of inequity in terms of opportunity for public education. So I thought it presented a case study for us to kind of underlie our discussion that I think has been happening and coming about whether this first and last dollar rule makes sense as a matter of policy. We're not saying what the court said or didn't say. We're saying, does it make sense as a matter of policy? And I think that's a fair question for a legislative commission to ask. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Phil. Dick, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just a few words. Bill's phrasing, does it make sense? The it being first and last dollar. First and last dollar is our phrase. It's not anyone else's phrase. It's not what the Supreme Court has said. They've used different language. And I myself think that there's wiggle room, so to speak, in the language that they've used. It may not sound like it on the surface, but context matters a lot in any judicial inquiry and outcome. And Bill knows that better than most. So what's the context? In the old cases, the early cases, it's a context of local property taxation bearing the brunt of funding the public schools based on the local property wealth period. And the Massachusetts system moves off of that to a property tax that is calculated based on a uniform rate across the state, which is a very different thing. And that uniform rate is more like our statewide education property tax. If we go to some form of that, including actually the current form we have in New Hampshire, where we don't recover the excess that's generated in high property taxes, which would be comparable to Massachusetts local required minimum contribution system, that might well meet approval from our court, even though it's a local property tax. It might so work into that wiggle room that I was talking about. And I see Bill nodding his head. So that's definitely something we need to keep in mind as we think about this. And then just on your summary, Dave, I think a couple of things that to me are real takeaways from the Massachusetts system. I mentioned one of them earlier today, and that is the difference between their foundation budget amount per pupil and their total spending per pupil. And it's significant, it's 25% or so. And even with the phasing in, my understanding is that it will still be a significant difference between the two. And it's based on calculations that they've worked through, working up rather than through a formula, outcomes-based formula, working up from a set of inputs. But in the end, Massachusetts is very comfortable with this formula. Might we be with a adequacy formula, not an education, what do you call it? Education cost model, costing outcome, that a result that is lower than the total that ECM generates when done in the way AIR is done. That's a question that I think we all need to explore as we think about translating the work of AIR into legislative action, language.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, that's real important, Dick. I'm glad you pointed that out because yeah, one of the things Massachusetts did while like New Hampshire, they're they're right around 19,000 average per pupil cost, across the state. Their foundation formula for that is more like 13,000.
I think it's a little lower, Dave.
I think it's like between 12 and 13.
Yeah.
Yeah. But and then depending upon the resources in your district, the state is picking up anywhere from 17 to 90% of that 12 and a half, of that foundation amount. So it's a very different approach than what we're taking. And then
Dave, I saw Chris having a hand up too.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Bill. Chris, yeah.
Yeah, I thought one of the big takeaways, which wasn't emphasized very much, but it's something that's been bugging me, is while they have the same weights that we do, they make a major adjustment at the end related to teacher salary.
Mm-hmm.
And, we all know that salaries are the big bulk of expense here for any human service agency, 75, 80% of the costs when you have benefits there. When we asked her about that, she said, well, that's not a well understood part of the formula. It actually is, it accounts a lot for the amount that districts get, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so and I've looked at salaries, as I mentioned, of schools, both average schools within a district as well as across our state, and they're substantially different. And it continues to worry me that we're not taking that into account. Anyone who looks at our state or understands anything about our state knows that the economics across the state are very different in terms of salaries, and so I fear we're not attending enough to that, especially given Massachusetts, where we share a lot of the same metropolitan areas, where we're not accounting enough for that in what we're doing. So it's a question I continue to have.
Well, I think that's something that maybe we should bring up again with Drew, because I think it's one of the factors they looked at was that are there in fact regional cost differences around the state with respect to teacher salary. There certainly is among, between districts, but here in Hopkinton, we spend so much, and then you go 10 minutes away and they're spending something very, very different. But that's not so much a regional cost factor, but more of a, whatever their district decided to, that they could take as far as property taxes and teacher contracts and stuff like that. And I thought Drew did talk a little bit about today about the fact that there was pretty much a uniform, what was it called? The staffing personnel.
Yes, but I have a hard time believing that we are that much different than Massachusetts in our variations. And why if we are, it would be interesting to know what the underlying reasons are, because there's be some other structural differences. We're not that different in our teacher unions at mix. And so it continues, especially when she was very clear that that's a major accounting for differences in the formula.
Oh yeah, and Alice also made it clear that they also use different cost indexes around, within the state of Massachusetts when maintaining the formula too. So a lot of factors that were not statewide. Rick.
Dave, Drew is back on if he wants to comment on this exchange right now.
Great.
Dave, what Chris
Actually, hang on a second, Rick. We've got Drew on right now, and I want.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, like I said earlier, we did include that regional cost difference variable in our model, and we found that it didn't explain the variation in costs across the state of New Hampshire. And that's not to say that there aren't regional cost differences, but perhaps the regional cost differences in New Hampshire are already accounted for in the other variables that are included in the model. So for example, if regional cost differences are strongly related to poverty levels across the state, then it's reasonable that our poverty variable is already picking up those regional cost differences, and therefore the regional cost difference variable didn't identify differences because those differences are already accounted for in poverty levels or English learner rates. I know there's a few urban districts that have high English learner rates, and if those are the areas that have high costs, then it's possible that the English learner rates are accounting for those high costs and not the regional cost difference variables. So I think if we included it in our cost model for this reason, to account for variation in the cost of labor across districts, but it didn't show that it was statistically significant in New Hampshire, so we didn't include it as a weight. But I would suggest that the remaining variables are accounting for those differences in regional costs.
Great, thanks, Drew. And that's also a great example of why these formulas need to be periodically maintained, because as the demographics change, it could be that the staffing cost factor becomes more important. So, Rick.
Yeah, I want to just echo what Chris was trying to hammer on here in terms of teacher salaries and salaries of our employees and our administration. I'm in a community which is going through our third police chief in the last 4.5 years. We can't keep, and we have a force of 8 officers with 7 temporaries. We're going through switching and changing in terms of our school side and the district side as well. And when I look at the delivery of an adequate education, RSA 193E:3, under the indicators of a adequate education, the last one we added to that legislation was teacher and administrative turnover rates, and just at the school and the district level. This is significant in places like Haverhill, where we're sitting on top of Lebanon and Hanover, and absolutely, because of our economy, we can't compete. And we're seeing curriculum specialists, we're seeing wonderful teachers who can teach Spanish, etc. Bing, they're gone within a year. And they're the young person you just want to keep, but it's tough. So there are significant differences, even though we're a small state, we have them.
Right, but a lot of that, I think, is your teacher contracts. You know, Lebanon and Hanover might have very, I think Hanover has a PhD track.
Yeah, but to say we're having the same thing happen with our police force. We train them, and we say, if you're going to leave within 3 years, you're going to have to pay back for your training. They're gone anyways.
Yep.
Because they're going to that's going to be made up 1 year later down in Hanover, Lebanon. So yes, contracts are part of it. There's a whole lot of issues coming into play here. Education levels of the communities, leadership within the communities, aspiration. I could go on with a whole host of variables that we're not including in our.
Right. But I think what that's saying, though, Rick, isn't that saying that the salaries that are offered in Haverhill may not be sufficient?
Or maybe the building's not sufficient for the chemistry teacher.
There could be other things too, right?
So
right.
A lot of issues out there that play with adequacy.
All right, this is exactly what Bruce suspected was going to happen, was that I was going to wander off the reservation during this part of the pitch. So I'm just going to wrap it up with the other key things fiscal policy is looking at is we're obviously going to have to estimate revenue and put together relief packages. So I'm calling that revenue and relief, and also consider some sort of phase-in plan. And Jay brought up this morning, I think, a very good idea as things move forward, having maybe an implementation committee that and it's not this commission, but something that can really help manage the process over a number of years of phase-in. So that wraps. That's all I got. Back to you, Bruce.
All right, well, so good. Just a couple more things then before we get to public comment. One, we wanted to sort of bring to all of our attention that we do have to write a report that's going to have to be delivered to the legislature on or about December 1st, no later than December 1st. In order to get there, we have to have a full draft, including our, whatever we're going to call them, recommendations, considerations, about 4 weeks from now, so that we can, as a full commission, have a full conversation about that draft and make any final changes and edits, you know, as we go along. So I am going to share the screen again here. So we've begun to kind of create an outline for what that final report's going to look like. We'll start with a brief summary of the history of the issue itself. Something that this commission, you know, the commission members are familiar with, but we need to ground our report in what brought us up to 2020. A short section on how the commission carried out its work, how often we met, who we heard from, what kinds of experts. Some sense that this commission has been hard at work since January, with a very short hiatus when we couldn't meet due to the early days of COVID, and then our continued online meeting. And then each work group would probably have a section in the final report, excuse me, what it looked at, what the questions were that it addressed, what the data were that it considered, and so that people understand how we arrived at then these recommendations that go back to the charge. We always want to be sure that we haven't strayed too far, and we've kept our recommendations and our attention to the initial legislative charge that created the commission last fall. A comment about data needs that we discovered along the way. For example, the ongoing conversation about special education and the categories of kids that are receiving special education services, and the fact that we had a hard time nailing that down to create a more precise weighting formula. And then considerations that might be different from recommendations that will guide the next legislature as bills get written, things that might be short-term versus long-term considerations. For example, one consideration rather than a recommendation might be what are the appropriate performance outcome measures that should be used in the future to identify the ability of a school district to achieve that statewide average outcomes. And then accountability comes up again, especially given that we are making this turn from an input-based formula to a student-centered outcome-based formula. What does that have to, what are the implications of that for accountability processes and standards that the DOE would oversee? Some kind of implementation plan. Dave just referenced the notion of an implementation committee. You know, what the horizon is for that. Is that a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year phased in implementation over time? Where do we start now? How often should the formula itself get reviewed? And then a series of appendices at the end that link back to prior studies that have been completed, all of the engagement input that we've received, and the expert input that we've received, and then a calendar demonstrating, and all of these will be linked to the website, of course. So this won't necessarily be a single hard copy document of 300 pages. There'll be easy links and easy access back to all the resources on the Carsey website as well. So not for discussion today necessarily, but just to give you an idea that we've begun to structure what this final report should look like. As you can see, begun to make some writing assignments related to it. The Carsey team will be supporting writing throughout this, but this will be the voice of and the recommendations of the commission, of course, not of the staff that brought you this. So Dave, I don't know if you want to take any quick comments on that or not.
No, I mean, I think that was a good, you know, high level, you know, table of contents for how we were thinking, you know, the report would be organized. Certainly open to suggestions and improvements. And you know, if it's something that you just want to sort of reflect on and come up with some things, email them to me or Bruce, or if you want to share some thoughts now. Absolutely, I think none of us are wed to you know, the table of contents.
Dave, can
Bruce send a copy of that working document to each of us
course.
so that we could start thinking right now and working to help out?
Yeah, absolutely. Having just shared that now, it's now a matter of the public record. This will go into the minutes of this meeting, but I'll send that document out to the commission members as I did with those questions and where we are with answering a variety of questions. If you look at that questions document, which will also be posted, of course, as part of the minutes, you'll get it. You'll probably feel a little bit nauseous looking at that because there are some really critical questions that we continue to need to dig into, and some may be beyond our capacity, but most of them I think are ones that we really need to nail down, as I said, in the next few weeks within our work groups and then within the full commission conversations. But I'll send you that final report, work in progress as well.
Right. And we've said this before, but we hopefully what the report is going to do is be useful for policy writers. So House, Senate, Governor's office, and be able to set forth the principles that we've all sort of agreed to that would help be the framework for a competent education funding model. And competent education funding doesn't necessarily mean that oh yeah, this is the one that Dick Ames puts forth, or this is the one Bill Ardinger puts forward, or this is the one Mary Heath puts forward. They could all be competent education funding models, and maybe ones that not all of us are going to get behind, but hopefully their education funding plans that embrace and that recognize and embrace the principles that that we've agreed to on, or that we are looking to agree to or will agree to as we put out a final report. And at the end of the day, we might disagree on approaches, and I think that's fine. But as long as they recognize a lot of the I guess the findings that AIR has developed, then I think we will have really served Granite Staters well by really laying out a blueprint or a framework on how to judge education funding. Sorry about that, Bruce.
No, that's all right. Let's see. Okay, nothing else in chat I was going to count on. So, and you've seen the key question document. I don't think we'll take time to roll that up again, but you can, again, use that as a way to build your own work and questions and ideas. So I think, Dave, actually, it's a 4:07, so we're a few minutes ahead of public comment time. But Dave, anything else that you or Jay or Mel want to bring up today, and then we can move to public comments.
Let me go over to Jay because I've taken up a lot of time.
No, I'll come back to the Thursday meeting for adequacy. It's in the calendars. It's been noticed. We probably should convene, but I don't see it as a long meeting.
Okay.
I really, Bruce, if there are questions about writing, and I do encourage folks signed up for sessions that this last meeting. If you've got something prepared, maybe we can see it in advance. But hey, thank you.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that. I was hoping we were going to get to this today.
All right. Is there more to this?
Make sure that I get those assignments right. I think that's who I heard volunteering. Sort of volunteering.
Building aid is Dave and Rick.
Okay, good. I can.
Or Rick and Dave. No, I mean, I had a little bit of this conversation with Ardinger this morning, but Rick and I agree on a whole lot of things. We disagree on some things, but I know Rick has dedicated a lot of time towards building aid and knows a lot about it. So I definitely appreciate being able to draw on his expertise in this area. So
I'm not sure I can add much on charter schools. I see my name there, but I'm not sure why.
I may have gotten that wrong, Dick, when I was taking notes about who was signing up for what.
Yeah, that's wrong.
I think it's not right, Bruce, on that. I saw that too.
Okay. Anybody else want to help Jane on charter schools?
I will offer with.
Thank you. Good correction.
Exactly what are you trying
I'd welcome anybody else, because I think that this is they are public school students. They will receive aid. It's just I don't think we've really covered this well with just how to add a differentiated aid figure to charter schools any different from what we're doing today.
And the intention here is these are briefs. These will be a page or two. What did we learn about each of these? What are the key issues? And what might we want to say about them in our final report? Not necessarily targeted specific recommendations or changes in policy at this point, but at least as placeholders, what needs to be said to guide policymaking going forward around these categorical programs.
Jay, in regard, where are you going in terms of the career technical education in those centers? We have a number of high schools that's starting to, or have been all along, have some portion of a vocational program within the high school, which is not part of the CTE program. We're seeing that as a cost, which is measured in their DOE 25 forms. I don't object to that. I think that we need to have more skill on that way to career pathways and certification in those areas. But are you actually considering this to be part of the task of this committee, or is that a separate task, which is a huge task in terms of capital projects, in terms of who does what? I'm willing to work with Val on that. I'm on the same committee as Val is in the advisory council. We have some other very good people that are on that council that, we have, which are directors, which could also give us support. Where are we going with this? That may be I'll stop talking. Where are you going with terms of CTE?
Right. Well, so, and Val, maybe, good, you're still there. Yeah, so we know that what we currently fund as categorical aid to CTE is largely tuition payments and transportation costs. And that those tuition payments go to the receiving CTE centers. So we can describe the current state and indicate that, we're getting the outcomes that we are, which is, or at least the participation rate that we are, which is very low. And the question of what are the strategies for boosting that participation rate? I think you and Val, from your experience being on that advisory council, might offer some suggestions, or at least the pathway for developing some suggestions about how to increase those participation rates. And clearly one of the ways to do it is to embed it in every high school in the state, which is the example from Delaware, which was presented to us. Anyway, I don't see us having the funding recommendation necessarily, but at least gives some sense of where the policy might go and where, from what direction might come.
Probably add Rick to the CTE.
I'd like to work with Val.
Brief. Yeah, yeah.
Val, you can work with Bruce and everybody else. Not this Bruce. You know the Bruce I'm talking about.
Yep, yep.
And I think we should also change catastrophic aid to special education aid.
Yeah.
Who else wants to volunteer? Come on, jump on. We're good?
Bruce, I'd like to be part of the CTE one as well.
Great.
Great. You meant to type Rick.
Yeah, not
Rick. Thank you. Freudian slip.
I know you meant that.
All good?
Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay.
And I do recall the reason Bill wasn't on that list is he's saving himself for another assignment from Dave.
No, yeah. Bill's actually helping out with the relief side of the revenue relief equation.
So otherwise, I think we got everybody from the adequacy group pitching in on with Bruce. So we'll do a check-in at 3 o'clock and just see where we are overall, answering the questions that Bruce, you have teed up for us. And we can take a look at the final report too, sections. Sure.
And Bruce, do we want to have or Jay, I guess, these sort of briefs on the categorical aid for next Monday?
That's the goal.
But not for the full commission. I mean, I don't envision the full commission looking at the first draft.
That's right.
The adequacy group would do it on
week from Thursday, something like that.
That's right.
Thursday, yes.
Yeah, and then so back to the full commission November 2nd. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. So we're right on time. Let's see. Do we have anything else in our business agenda before I get to public comment?
That's it.
Okay. All right. Everybody good? Because I'm just gonna sort of put
Well, Dave,
yeah.
Are we going to set up any times in which, for example, like Val and I and others might get involved with the CTE, or when Jane and all are going to be working on a special education aid?
You just work on it offline. I mean, I talked with Bill this morning on relief ideas, and you and I have emailed a couple of times on building aid stuff. So, you and I should probably do set a time where we can either have a call or we don't have to Zoom. I can just call you and to talk about building aid. But I think just set it up on your own.
But Dave, I'll send out a little bit of guidance for just so each of these briefs is somewhat standard. What have we learned? Who do we learn from? What have we learned? What are where do the sort of glitches in current policy seem to show up? And what are the principles that all of this might
good
from? So probably tomorrow morning I'll send something out to those folks whose names we just saw. Just a little guidance.
Good. And we can certainly have your support for getting copies of minutes and stuff like that.
Sure.
With different
on the website.
Yep.
You can always email me too.
Yeah, it does. I can talk with Val, but I'm sure there's others that we might want to solicit some information from, because we know what our situation is now. We know what we want to go for as a target, hopefully, but how we're going to get there is going to be a chore.
but I think we have a lot that we can put together for the CTEs. I just want to make sure if it's going to go in this final report, that we do a good job right now within the week here. And I think CTE is going to be where we go in education, truthfully. And we need to, it's our manufacturing, our skills, our jobs. And there's a lot of folks in business industry that want to work with us on that. Automobile Association, Restaurant Association, etc.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, where it comes to where, you know, like you say, Rick, where it's going down the road, we don't necessarily need to solve those problems as part of this commission's work, but I think highlighting some of those things that we did hear about when we had the folks from the DOE with us talking about CTE programs. But, you know, specifically, I mean, you know, I've certainly been on a school board where we were strapped for tuition and strapped for transportation, you know, costs, and both held back or both hurt our ability to enroll students in CRTC.
Or that's statewide. That's a
yeah. But I'm just saying from the Hopkins School Board, so you know, perspective, we knew what we had to work with for resources to send kids to the CRTC in Concord. And we know when resources were drying up too.
Yeah.
All righty. Then I'm going to go ahead and open the floor to some of our attendees who are with us today. And we got a hand up from Jeff and Jordan. You're taking care of the logistics here. Jeff, welcome.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yeah, good.
Great. Well, first I want to thank all the members of the commission, not only for their work to date, but for all the time they've devoted today. It's been an exceptionally long meeting. And so I just have a brief comment I wanted to offer. It'll be brief, both in view of the amount of information you've taken in, and also because I wasn't fully prepared to speak today. But I did want to respond to a suggestion that had been offered earlier in the meeting. And in particular, I wanted to express some hesitancy or concern about the idea that the student-centered outcome approach might shift from targeting a statewide average measure to something that is more along the lines of a range. I would be concerned about that kind of approach, given what it might imply about the provision of an adequate education in New Hampshire, in that it would contemplate some students achieving outcomes that are less than that statewide average. And I guess I would ask rhetorically, if the state were to follow that approach, who are the students that are most likely to achieve that less than average education? I would also encourage the commission, and I would really think it would be incumbent upon it, that if it intends to pursue this sort of range of an approach, that it be very transparent and clear about what those measures or what that range of measures might mean on a district by district basis. For instance, right now, the measure that AIR has constructed consists of, I believe, logarithmic transformations of a variety of measures. And I think, as anyone who's sat in on this meeting today will understand, that's not easy to explain to people. And so I think you need to be very clear about, well, if we're going to have a measure that is one standard deviation away from the average, what does that mean for the graduation rate that's tolerable? What does that mean for the assessment score that's tolerable? And really think long and hard about what that variation is going to mean across the state. And I'll stop there, and I thank you again for your time.
Great. Thanks so much for the comment, Jeff. Let's see. What else we got? A lot of people attending today, which is great for a long meeting on a Monday.
Yeah, we should schedule these long meetings more often. Get more folks. We do have one more, at least one more tentatively in November on our calendar.
Mm-hmm.
We'll need it.
Oh, yeah. Doug's got his hand up. Great. Well, welcome, Doug.
Thank you. My only comment has to do with the outline for your report. And I'm hearkening back to House Bill 4, which established the commission and set up, I think there were 7 different things that the commission was charged with doing, and would hope that the final report would address each of those, because that's what established it. In addition to the much larger amount of material that you already put into that draft as what you want to put together. But I just hope you go back and look at that charge and say, okay, we'll respond maybe in a sentence or 2 to each of the items in the charge.
Great. Thanks, Doug. I'm glad you raised that. Okay. I know it's been a long afternoon, so we might even get out 5 minutes early. I don't know, we'll just give it another minute. Any thoughts or comments from members on the commission? Yeah, Corrine.
While we're waiting, just had a question, probably more for Bruce. Is, I look at the timeline and find it very short. December 1st is only 5 weeks away. Will there be an extended time for the full commission to actually have a deep conversation if needed, to go over a draft of the report? And then I would think we would need the time to go over it again before submission. Are you thinking along those lines, or it's just like it's in a couple of weeks or in a few weeks? I just, I mean, we seem to be very productive when we have the longer meetings because we can get a lot more information from each other. So just question that as I look at the timeline.
Dave, do you want to do this, or do you want to pause?
No, good. Can you take it, Bruce?
Are we all set with public comment then?
Well, let's talk about this, and then if there's anything else that comes up in the next 4 minutes, we can do public comment too. But
so if you see where my cursor is, there's the full commission timeline. There's today, this week, extended meeting. We've added another meeting for a week from today already, so we'll continue the topics that we've talked about today. In the meantime, there will also be work group meetings later this week on Thursday. I'm not sure if engagement's meeting on Thursday. It is, okay. So then 2 weeks from today,
Yeah.
the commission meets again. Thank you, Carrie. So in a sense, we have 3 meetings, 3 weeks in a row. Today, next Monday, 2 weeks from today, for full commission meetings. And then a week after that, November 9th, we're thinking about adding a meeting that Thursday of that week in order to allow for final work group meetings on Monday, the 9th, which is when they would normally be taking place anyway. So squeezing another meeting in that Thursday, I know you're thrilled to hear that. And then mid-November 16th, on the normal Monday, we'd be meeting, again, extending that to a 1 to 4:30, because then we'll really have some degree of final draft report in front of us. So, and then potentially adding a meeting on Monday, the 23rd, to go through that final report again before a final vote on Monday, November 30th. So
okay,
there you go. Be careful what you ask.
Yeah. I know that makes sense, though. I just, I'm planning out and I just want to see where we're going, and the time is pretty limited, but okay, that spells it out really well. Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, we'll make sure that everybody gets some version of this.
Yeah.
So great. Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Corrine, for raising that up. All right. So we're at 4:28, and I don't see any new hands up. So oh, we got one. We've got Jane Farini. So Jordan. Thanks, Jordan. Hey, welcome, Jane.
Hello. I just was very interested in the questions left to be answered from the adequacy group and their really large burden at looking at the other sources of tax revenue for education and the various assignments that the folks on the commission have been assigned. That is something that I think is a very challenging but important inquiry because I think what all of the public comment has relayed to date is that the property tax is overburdened. And the issue of that has been, you know, resounding, I think, for every focus group, and regardless of whether they're the Taxpayers Association or, you know, the elderly group that was focused, as well as I even think the educators might have even referenced that as an issue too. So I just urge this committee to be open-minded and to really examine that piece that's coming up. It's a challenging piece, but I do believe that the property tax burden is a tough one on folks. And I also think nobody wants to return to a donor town situation because that always has controversy associated with it. So I know that this group has really worked hard at public engagement. I know it's been very challenging though because of COVID. And I know you were going to take this show on the road and you couldn't, you know, so it's all been remote. But I do think there are communities that, you know, haven't really been able to participate to the extent that they might have. And I think this issue is so darn complicated that it's scary for people to reach out to this commission and say, I don't get this, or this is really a lot for new elected officials, for folks that aren't, you know, involved in education funding. I truly commend the work of this commission. But I am going to be, you know, quite honest, any sort of formula that would have a, you know, that donor town component with the SWEPT and the property tax. I know that's not a goal of this commission, but I think it would be problematic and a challenge. But certainly what you've got ahead of you is yeoman's work. You've already put in yeoman's work on this really tough issue, but I just feel it would be inappropriate for me to not just say that in black and white.
Jane, thanks for sharing your comments, and also thanks for being with us today and for all of your commitment to this entire process. So I know it's been a lot of time for you as well. So
thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, I think we're just a little bit after 4:30, so I'm not seeing any other hands. So so I think we're good to wrap. Yeah. Mel, Jay, Bruce. Good. All right. Thanks everybody for their time, and we'll see y'all on Thursday. All right. Take care.